People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Oh!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Good afternoon, you're watching GB News Live with myself, Martin Daubney and Emily Carver, coming up for you this Tuesday lunchtime.
Yes, all eyes are on the COVID inquiry this afternoon as Dominic Cummings prepares to give evidence. The picture painted so far is one of disorganisation and chaos. The inquiry was told this morning by former Downing Street Director of Communications Lee Kane that COVID was the wrong crisis for Boris Johnson's skill set.
And we'll be live in Scampton as the High Court hears an injunction application from West Lindsey District Council to stop up to 2,000 migrants being housed on the former RAF site of the Dambusters home. The council argues the Home Office does not have planning permission for such a site.
And we'll also be live in Tel Aviv as Israel continues their ground offensive in Gaza. The IDF reports large exchanges of fire overnight. We'll have the very latest on the ground. And here, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says the right to self-defence is fundamental, but it is not a blank cheque.
And we have the latest from Kenya as the King and Queen embark on their first state visit to a Commonwealth and African country. Charles now acknowledged the painful aspects of the UK and Kenya's shared history during the couple's 4-day state visit. But before we start all of this, here's your latest headlines with Sophia.
Good afternoon, it's 1 minute past 12. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB Newsroom. A public health catastrophe in Gaza is now imminent, according to the World Health Organization. The mass displacement of people, coupled with damage to water and sanitation services, is creating a dire situation for residents. It comes as Israel's Prime Minister dismissed calls for a ceasefire in the war against Hamas, saying that it would mean surrendering to terrorism. More than 8,300 people have been killed by Israeli attacks in Gaza. Rishi Sunak's government has been clear in its support for Israel, but is urging for a humanitarian pause in the fighting to get aid into Gaza. Sir Keir Starmer has reaffirmed Labour's support for a humanitarian pause in the Israel-Hamas war. Speaking a short time ago, the Labour leader said it was the only credible approach to the ongoing conflict. But he urged that a permanent ceasefire could risk more violence in the region, giving Hamas a chance to carry out more attacks.
Every stage during this crisis, my approach has been driven by the need to respond to both these tragedies, to stand by the right to self-defence of any nation which suffers terrorism on this scale, alongside the basic human rights of innocent Palestinians caught once again in the crossfire.
The COVID inquiry has heard Dominic Cummings warn Boris Johnson the Cabinet Office was totally behind and had no plan to deal with the pandemic. Mr Cummings served as Boris Johnson's chief advisor until he was forced to quit in 2020 for breaking lockdown rules. Lee Kane, who was Director of Communications, spoke of a lack of leadership and says the former Prime Minister should have done more during the pandemic's early phase. The government has called off plans to close train ticket offices. The Transport Secretary asked train operators a short time ago to withdraw the controversial proposal to shut offices in England. A public consultation launched to gauge the public opinion on the closures received the largest ever response, with the RMT union saying most people opposed the closures. Mark Harper says the proposals didn't meet the high thresholds of serving rail passengers. There's more relief on the way today for households feeling the pinch from the rising cost of living. Those eligible will receive a payment of £300, the second in a series of support packages. The money will be deposited into the bank accounts of people on certain benefits and will have no impact on existing benefits. More than 8 million households will be helped by the cost of living payments. Around 400,000 patients who've waited the longest for NHS care will be asked if they're willing to go elsewhere. People who've been on wait lists for more than 10 months may receive a letter, text message or email to ask if they'd consider travelling for treatment. Transferring patients to other hospitals could help bring down record backlogs in the health service, currently standing at 7.75 million. Yellow warnings for wind and rain are in place across the country until Friday as Storm Ciarán approaches. Flooding has hit parts of Northern Ireland this morning, with people advised not to travel. An amber warning is in place in counties Antrim, Down and Armagh. It comes as the storm is set to bring strong winds and heavy rain to the UK. Newry and Armagh MP Mickey Brady says the government is doing everything it can to protect homes and businesses.
We're dealing with nature here. I mean, it's unprecedented the amount of rain that's fallen over the past day or two. And as I said, in my lifetime, and I've been around a long, long time, I have never seen it this bad. We're trying to do our best to ensure that the least damage is done. And I know the like of BID and other agencies locally are trying their best to ensure that sandbags are provided and the businesses are made as secure as it can be possible.
Pomp and pageantry were on full display this morning as the King and Queen touched down in Kenya for a state visit. Their Majesties were greeted in Nairobi by Kenyan President William Ruto. It's the King's first visit as monarch to the country where his mother became Queen in 1952. The King paid his respects to Kenya's fallen heroes, military and civilian, at the tomb of the unknown warrior. He also visited a model farm which serves as an information centre for the local community and also provides food for the hospital. This is GB News across the UK, on TV, in your car, on your digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now, back to Martin and Emily.
And thanks for that, Sophia. OK, the UK COVID inquiries brace for the explosive testimony of former Chief Advisor to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, of course. That's Dominic Cummings, as he prepares to launch what is largely expected to be a devastating and withering broadside attack on the former Prime Minister's handling of COVID.
Yes, earlier today, the inquiry heard from Johnson's first Director of Communications in Number 10, that's Lee Kane, who didn't mince his words, did he? He said that Johnson was the wrong Prime Minister to handle the pandemic and how his actions resulted in greater damage being brought by the virus.
Well, our Deputy Political Editor, Tom Harwood, is outside the inquiry. So, Tom, at the moment, we have the Support Act, the warm-up still there. Lee Kane, we're getting ready for the highlight act, the Rod Stewart, if you like. We're expecting a Halloween horror show, aren't we?
We certainly are, and to some extent, the highlights of the first part of the inquiry today, of the morning of the inquiry today, even though it's been Lee Cain that has been being questioned, some of the most highlight moments have been messages that Dominic Cummings has sent. In the last 10 or so minutes, we've heard the COVID inquiry lawyer read out some pretty spicy language sent from Dominic Cummings to individuals, including Lee Cain, describing the cabinet in 2020 as, and I quote, useless F-pigs, although the word F was read out in rather a more expletive form, as you might be able to imagine. The cabinet were, or certain members of the cabinet were also described by Mr Cummings in one email as C-words, and we were hearing a lot about how Mr Cummings wanted to force Boris Johnson to reshuffle people like Matt Hancock out of the picture. But that isn't all that we've been hearing, of course. Lee Cain has been putting forward his own views, which seem to have differed pretty starkly from those of the government, particularly over the summer of 2020 and the beginning of the autumn of that year, where Mr Cain seems to be agreeing with Mr Cummings that the government was not acting in the best interests of the country, was being led more by the media than by the science, and Mr Cain saying he was supporting more restrictive measures in September 2020 as the government was trying to get people back to work.
Tom, what time are we expecting Dominic Cummings to take to the stage, and what might he say that's new? He's already said quite a lot, hasn't he?
He has, although what we've found throughout the course of this morning is that there is more and more information coming out in terms of these WhatsApps and these emails. This inquiry has statutory powers, so it can comb through all of this information, and of course the submissions provided by the individuals it is questioning does reveal new material. So it is likely we will see some new messages come out from Mr Cummings on top of those that he has already made public, of course. We don't know exactly when Mr Cummings is going to take to his seat. I have been told that they wanted to get to him early this afternoon. Mr Cain was to be the morning, Mr Cummings was to be the afternoon, but Mr Cain is running a little bit over, as we've seen throughout this week in this inquiry. The questioning is taking rather longer than had been expected, so it's a bit of a movable feast. It may well be that Mr Cummings takes to the stage after lunch, although he has, of course, arrived at the inquiry building in the last few minutes.
And Tom, of course, Cummings will have a few spicy words. Is there anything in it? I mean, is this a bitter employee with an axe to grind? No love lost, of course, between Dom and Boris. And all of the major allegations in the past, Boris has simply brushed aside, or denied. Are we expecting anything to come out of this, or is it just pure popcorn time, box office and great politics and a great spectacle for the rest of us to watch?
Well, some of it, of course, will be fireworks and popcorn time, but we've got to look at this inquiry through a more analytical lens, I suppose. These are players who were key to making decisions throughout the course of the pandemic, who are each now presenting their own vision of history. No doubt some of these people will be trying to paint themselves in the best possible light and perhaps dunk former colleagues in the problematic areas. But of course we will be hearing new information, and I think most pertinently, more than what is said by the individuals in their testimony today, it will be the WhatsApps and the emails that will reveal what was actually said at the time. This could be the real spice and the real disagreements at the top of government, the oscillation that Lee Cain has been describing this morning of those making decisions between whether there should be more restrictive, harsher measures or whether things should be opened back up. It's interesting that Lee Cain this morning seems to be giving more credence to the government in the early stages of the pandemic, when things were unknown, when it was an entirely novel virus, and when, as he described, the tracks were being built as the train was going on. Where Lee Kane was more critical was in the second wave of the pandemic, when the government seemed to be making all the same mistakes, in his view, over again for a second time. It will be interesting to see if Dominic Cummings has that same criticism, if Dominic Cummings can find areas where he is willing to praise the government that he has been up till now pretty critical of, or whether he will be entirely critical. That will be an interesting point, how much nuance there will actually be in the following discussion.
Yes, well, fundamentally, we want to find out what exactly went wrong and what we can do better in preparation for another pandemic, if and when it comes. Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Political Editor there, Tom Harwood, from outside the COVID inquiry, where Lee Kane is still giving evidence. We're awaiting Dominic Cummings, of course.
I just think that what this highlights is they're completely dysfunctional. They didn't really know what was going on. They were kind of making it up as they went along. The WhatsApp messages, they have some choice language. I mean, the expletives.
Well, we were debating this earlier, weren't we, off air, over whether WhatsApp messages like these should be made public. Difficult for people in positions of power to make decisions knowing that they may then, their private messages may then become public. But then others would say this is important for scrutiny, of course.
And what was interesting, of course, is that Boris had that 7-day automatic WhatsApp message delete function added, criticised at the time, but now you might be grateful for that.
Yes, I imagine so. Well, Sir Keir Starmer, this is moving on to another story here. Sir Keir Starmer says now is not the right time for a ceasefire in the Middle East. He claims it would embolden Hamas and risk further violence immediately.
In a speech in central London, the Labour leader said a humanitarian pause is the only credible approach to the conflict in Gaza, calling it terrorism and brutality on a scale few countries have ever experienced.
Yes, our security editor, Mark White, is with us from Tel Aviv, live from Tel Aviv. Let's start. Mark, I just want to get your view on some breaking news that we're hearing from Paris. Police have shot an unarmed woman who was threatening to blow herself up at a Paris metro station. Can you bring us the latest on that?
Yeah, well, we know, of course, security services and police right across the West are on a heightened state of alert for potential terrorist-related incidents linked to the conflict here in Israel. This incident unfolded at a metro station, the Francois Mitterrand metro station in central Paris, with a woman apparently clad in a full burqa shouting Allahu Akbar, shouting Save Palestine, and also shouting that she had a bomb and was going to blow everything up. Now, she apparently refused to obey police commands to reveal whether she had a bomb or not, and the police, it seems, were left with no choice but to shoot her, because clearly, clad in a full burqa, there's no way that the police were able to tell whether she did have a device or not. There's no way anybody could get near her. She was clearly, in the minds of the French police, posing a significant threat to the surroundings and people in that area. So she was shot, we're told she was shot in the torso and is critically ill, taken to hospital, still alive at this stage but critically injured. Interestingly, she was apparently not carrying any device, but how would any officer know that when she is clad and she is refusing to obey those basic police instructions? So that's an indication, as I say, of the heightened state of alert. We had here in Israel just yesterday a police officer stabbed and critically injured in Jerusalem by a Palestinian man. So some real tensions in many cities, towns and cities right across the West, and of course here in Israel. To get back to your introduction there about that speech from Sir Keir Starmer in central London, an important speech, I think, for the Labour leader, reiterating the fact that he does not want to see a ceasefire, but he does want to see humanitarian pauses. And he said the reason he did not want to see a ceasefire is because he believes that a ceasefire effectively ends the fighting with both sides frozen with the capabilities that they currently have. And for Hamas, that would mean that they still have the capabilities, and we know this because every day we're still getting rocket attacks into Israel. We had one just a few moments before you came to us into the area around the Gaza Strip. And so Keir Starmer said that would leave Hamas emboldened and able to regroup and to try to create more turmoil in Israel by causing more terrorist attacks in the future. But he did want to see humanitarian pauses. He said they should take place as a matter of urgency to get more aid supplies in to help the people of Gaza who are, clearly suffering greatly at this time. And a very interesting and powerful part of his speech, I thought, was when he said, in conflicts like this, the most painful blows are those that land on the bruises of history. And for Palestinians, the threat of displacement sends a shiver down the spine. And he said then, in response to that, that Israel must give an immediate guarantee to the Palestinian people in Gaza that although they might have to move out of harm's way at the moment, they would be allowed to return as a matter of urgency once there was a cessation in violence, whenever that might be. One final thing to bring to you, I think, that is important as well, talking about powerful speeches. We heard from an Israeli commander addressing his troops in Gaza at the moment over the radio in their tanks. Very powerful speech to those troops pushing forward in Gaza. I want you to take a listen to what was said.
Southern Command Forces, this is the commander. We are striking Hamas and the terrorist organisations in the Gaza Strip. We have one goal, victory. No matter how long or how hard the fighting will be, there is no other outcome than victory. We will fight with professionalism and strength, based first and foremost on the IDF values which were instilled in us, dedication to mission and the pursuit of victory. We will fight in alleys, we will fight in tunnels, we will fight wherever necessary.
Well, we're told that on the battlefield at the moment that Israel and the IDF forces are moving forward slowly and systematically. They are coming under, we're told, heavy arms fire from Hamas terrorists, missiles that are being launched towards their armoured vehicles, and also machine gun fire. But they, apparently, according to the IDF, are dealing with this one placement at a time.
OK, Mark White, live in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much. That latest update, the whole area on a knife edge. And now, of course, that's spreading into Paris and who knows where next.
Yes, well, coming up, we'll be live in Scampton as the High Court decides whether former military bases can be used to house asylum seekers. We'll find out the very latest. See you shortly.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Right, welcome back to GB News Live.
Yeah, and breaking news, Dominic Cummings has just arrived. In fact, he's just sat down at the COVID inquiry, about to give evidence. There we have live shots from there, expected to be an explosive session. We're very much looking forward to this all week.
The inquiry understands that from 2007 to 2014, you were a special advisor to Michael Gove MP. Is that correct?
Yes.
In October 2015, you became a director of the organisation Vote Leave, which culminated, of course, in the June 2016 referendum. And I think it's fair to say you were an architect in the successful Leave EU campaign.
Forgive me, sorry, our campaign was called Vote Leave. The other one was called Leave EU.
Thank you. On the 24th of July 2019, you became a senior advisor to the then Prime Minister. Is that correct?
Yeah.
A general election was called relatively shortly thereafter. Did you, as is customary, resign as an advisor once Parliament had been dissolved, or did you stay in that post throughout the election campaign and then continue thereafter?
I'm afraid I can't remember the exact legal status that I had between the election being called and through the election. There are complicated rules, and also I had a slightly odd role in that time because I was neither in campaign headquarters nor was I full-time in Number 10. I was kind of in a separate room, and I continued doing some government work during that time, for example, with NATO and some national security things. I think there was a terrorist episode, floods, various things. So I was sort of hopping around between two different things.
All right. Mr. Cummings, I'm going to ask you, please, to remember that whilst you give evidence, it's essential that you try to keep your voice up and you speak as slowly as possible. That way, we may better understand your evidence. Did you play a part in the general election campaign, culminating in the 12th of December election?
Yes.
All right. I'd like to turn, please, to some of the government structures which form the large part of your witness statement and about which you express, I think, what may fairly be described as very trenchant views, starting with the Cabinet. You say in your statement that the Cabinet was largely irrelevant to policy or execution in 2020. The combination of its size, the Prime Minister's inability to chair it, and its constant leaks meant it was seen by everyone in Number 10 as not a place for serious discussion. You go on to describe how those working in Number 10 see it as another problem to manage while real discussions happen elsewhere. The inquiry material shows that there were, although this may not be reflected in the minutes, frank and constructive debates held in Cabinet, as they say in diplomatic circles, and that there were important decisions made in Cabinet and important matters debated. Is that a fair summary, therefore, of the role of Cabinet during the coronavirus crisis?
I think it depends, to some extent, it depends what you mean by the word decision. I mean, formally, a lot of things are decided in Cabinet, obviously, that's the formal constitutional structure. But very rarely is that actually a reflection of the reality of how the, quote, decision, unquote, is actually being made.
So is it more of a reflection of the fact that important decisions started to become taken elsewhere, predominantly in number 10?
I wouldn't say it started to be. I think that was the case in 2019. And of course, it's been a feature for many decades of this trend increasing.
If we may call that process a sidelining of Cabinet, did you contribute to that process, do you think?
I would say more that I just managed it as a sort of like the weather. I mean, it was just a sort of fact of life. It was a combination of the constitutional crisis in 2019, the Prime Minister's own personal temperament, habits that had grown up in the Cabinet Office over many years, going back a long period. I actually said to the Prime Minister...
Slow down, Mr. Cummings, please, slow down. I said to the Prime Minister.
I suggested to the Prime Minister, both in the last week of the election campaign in 2019 and in the first week of January, when we discussed the future generally, that he should strongly consider A, a major reshuffle, and B, radically shrinking the size of the Cabinet back to where it was something like 100 or so years ago. Because as anyone who knows who has dealt with very large organisations, it's impossible to have serious conversations with 25, 30 people around a table like that. The Prime Minister did not want to.
Due in large part to your own WhatsApps, Mr. Cummings, we're going to have to coarsen our language somewhat.
I apologise.
You called ministers useless fuckpigs, morons, cunts, in emails and WhatsApps to your professional colleagues. Do you think you contributed to a lack of effectiveness on the part of ministers and of the Cabinet?
No, I think I was reflecting a widespread view amongst competent people at the centre of power at the time about the calibre of a lot of senior people who are dealing with this crisis extremely badly.
Slow down, please, Mr. Cummings. Are you suggesting that your views expressed in those revolting ways were shared by others?
Well, my appalling language is obviously my own, but my judgment of a lot of senior people was widespread.
Do you feel that you expressed your views too trenchantly, that your opinion of ministers and of the Cabinet overstated the position?
No, I would say, if anything, it understated the position, as events showed in 2020.
Cabinet meetings appear, according to your statement and the material that we've seen, to have been, to some extent, scripted. But insofar as Cabinet committee meetings were concerned, they were very largely scripted. Ministers were given scripts to read out.
And just a quick message here. Apologies if you're offended by some of the coarse language, but of course this is the direct transcription of WhatsApp messages that were exchanged during this inquiry. They have simply been replicated live by the questioner. Apologies again if you're offended by the coarse language.
And obviously there are exceptions, and there are some people who chaired Cabinet committee meetings who did an extremely good job. So I'm not claiming that this is universal. I'm saying that it was a general feature and it was much more often true than not.
You refer in your statement to Cabinet and Cabinet committee meetings being Potemkin meetings. What did you mean by that?
They were Potemkin in the sense that they were for show, as part of the sort of show of the Constitution. that, unfortunately, a large part of how the system works is that ministers parade up Downing Street, the cameras click, people act like Cabinet is actually deciding things, but everyone behind the number 10 door actually near power knows that that's very rarely actually what's going on. That usually what's happening is that senior officials have actually decided what's happening, and the ministerial performance is often / usually a performance. Of course, that changes according to historical situations and crises, and sometimes Cabinet, even in 2019, 2020, became genuinely important. But I'm just trying to give a general picture.
On the cusp of the coronavirus pandemic, where was power exercised? Where was the effective decision-making?
By cusp, where do you mean, sorry?
January, February.
Well, it certainly wasn't in Cabinet.
Where was it?
Well, most power really is nominally in the hands of the Prime Minister, and to a very large extent in the hands of the Cabinet Office. I would say the Cabinet Secretary is something like 10 times or 100 times more powerful than anybody else in the Cabinet, apart from the Prime Minister. All sorts of elements of real power actually now in our system answer to him, but a large part of the performance and the media coverage is aimed at trying to cover up this fact and to try and portray the ministers as actually in charge.
Over time, you recommended and you brought into effect two very important meetings, or two important processes. One was the 8:15 officials meeting, at which you and other officials discussed the day's events, resolved to raise important matters that needed to be debated. And then at 9:15 daily, there became meetings with the Prime Minister in his study or in the Cabinet room. Where did that take place?
The sort of formal part of it was in the, the 8:15 was in the Cabinet room every day. The 9:15 was usually also in the Cabinet room. Sometimes that would be preceded by a smaller meeting in the Prime Minister's study, which adjoins the Cabinet room through a kind of joint door.
Were your 8:15 officials meetings minuted or noted?
I'm not sure exactly what the process changed. Obviously, the 8:15 and 9:15 meetings I originally created out of the kind of air of disaster, and they were very informal, but they went through different iterations. So they became called different things, the 8:15 and the 9:15. I think there was at least 3 different formal iterations, and the bureaucratic processes will have been different for each one. I think right at the very beginning, at 8:15, there were kind of action points taken because it was very much an action-oriented thing. It wasn't any kind of formal structure. So I would guess that there were not formal minutes at those meetings to begin with, but there were certainly action points that Imran, the Private Secretary, and others would write live during the meeting and then circulate immediately afterwards.
By and large, as you say in your statement, there was little transparency or visibility. Traces of discussions might only be in an email or WhatsApp, if they exist at all. Is that correct?
I think it's certainly correct about the very first part, as I said, when we just created the meetings, because they had no kind of formal position of any kind, though I don't think that's accurate about later on.
The Cabinet Office, to which you've referred, you describe in this way, that it had more sand in the petrol tank rather than the Rolls-Royce gearbox, or gearbox it is often described as. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you speak to many people who've knocked around the system for a very long time, the Cabinet Office over a long period of time has accumulated more and more power, formal and informal. It's become incredibly bloated. It's acquired huge numbers of people, huge numbers of teams, and particularly on the sort of deep state, national security side, crisis management, has become in all sorts of ways extremely opaque and effectively completely invisible to any political figure, including the Prime Minister. So it was extremely difficult to know in number 10 who exactly in the Cabinet Office was doing what, whose responsibility it was, who were we supposed to talk to get action, and that was critical in particularly in the first couple of months.
Was this a function of staffing levels, inadequate staffing levels, or over-staffing, or in particular parts of the Cabinet Office, or a reflection of the personalities, the people who were actually in the Cabinet Office?
I think it was a mix, like all dysfunctional systems. It was a mix of a lot of the wrong people in the wrong job, decades of accumulated power, no real scrutiny and insight, a culture of constantly classifying everything to hide mistakes and hide scrutiny. Management was bad, incredibly bloated, with so many senior figures that they themselves, as Helen McNamara's statement makes clear, the senior people themselves didn't know who on earth was in charge of what.
In your statement to the inquiry, you say that in 2020, a handful of senior officials were the wrong people for the posts. And this is in the context of your views on government generally, so not just the Cabinet Office, but number 10. This meant they were unable to replace other people who were wrong for their posts. However, it's the Prime Minister who is responsible for the wrong people remaining in crucial jobs. Were, in your opinion, the wrong people in those crucial jobs in the Cabinet Office?
Yes, I think that there clearly were some people in the Cabinet Office who were in the wrong jobs. The Cabinet Secretary and I had quite a few frank discussions about some of these problems going back into 2019. He actually removed some of the people at my request and moved them on to other things, though, of course, Whitehall being Whitehall, they were often promoted rather than actually removed. So, yes, there were. I agree with the thrust of your question.
Who else did you have in mind by that observation, that there were the wrong people in those jobs?
Well, I think he had never sought that job, and he had serious doubts about the wisdom of combining the Cabinet Secretary's job and the National Security Advisor job. I think that was correct. Mark was a very able diplomat. He had enormous skills in all sorts of ways, but the way in which the Cabinet Office has evolved. So, if we take it.
Well, perhaps we'll pause there. We'll just stay on the issue of the Cabinet Secretary.
Okay.
That Cabinet Secretary, Mark Sedwell, now Lord Sedwell, whom you've described as a talented and able diplomat in all sorts of ways, you denigrated and insulted by your WhatsApps and text messages, did you not?
I guess so. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but it's certainly the case that I came to the view that he did not have visibility of the fundamental disasters that were unfolding inside the Cabinet Office.
You used obscenities to describe him, and then in a series of texts and WhatsApps you said he was off the pace, his staff knew he was off the pace, he was unable essentially to function at all as the head of the Cabinet Office.
I don't think I actually said that he was unable to function at all, but the rest of what you said is correct. And this was not just my view. Part of what I was expressing to the Prime Minister was that other people in the Cabinet Office and crucial people in officials, not political people, in the Prime Minister's office had said to me, we fear that both the Cabinet Office has gone dreadfully wrong and that Mark doesn't understand just how badly wrong this has all gone.
You were unimpressed by the Principal Private Secretary. You believed that he deferred too much to the Prime Minister. He didn't force him to face up to hard choices. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that one of the that role is highly underrated, I think, in understanding how government really works. It's an extraordinarily powerful position in all sorts of ways. Again, much more powerful really than anybody in the Cabinet apart from the Prime Minister. It's a critical role. My view was that a role like that in a country like ours should be filled by one of the absolutely most able people that we can possibly muster in our country. And I made that argument to the Prime Minister before January, during the election, actually, about making a change in January. I lost the argument.
Slow down, please, Mr. Cummings. Slow down. You lost that argument.
I lost the argument. I made it again after the first wave, and I lost the argument again.
Your views on the Secretary of State for the Department of Health and Social Care are very well known, and we'll be looking at some of your remarks about him in due course. But overall, the tenor of your statement is to the effect, and this is to use your words, that senior ministers, senior officials, and senior advisors like yourself fell disastrously short of the standards that the public had to expect. Is that a view you adhere to still?
It is. I also think there were many exceptional people, as I've tried to also explain in my statement, but they were all enmeshed in a fundamentally dysfunctional structure, and that meant that even the great people were often unable to do great work.
You also say that it is completely crackers that someone like you should have been in number 10. Is that a view you still maintain?
For sure.
Ultimately, who bears the responsibility, Mr. Cummings, for appointing the individuals whom you have described in these terms?
Well, lots of them obviously were appointed. Lots of the critical cabinet office roles were appointed before me and the Prime Minister arrived. The Prime Minister obviously bears responsibility for the Cabinet. He appointed the Cabinet in summer 2019. Contrary to all the media reports, I had zero involvement with that. I tried to get him to change it in January and failed. Tried to get him to change it in February and almost completely failed.
Who appointed you, Mr. Cummings?
Prime Minister.
The inquiry has heard evidence that the Cabinet Office plays a vital role in government as the coordinating centre. It liaises with other government departments, it brokers issues, it resolves debates and issues between line departments. It is the hub of government. On your arrival in Downing Street in July of 2019, did you believe that the Cabinet Office was effectively performing that role?
No.
The Cabinet Secretary, the inquiry has been told, has an equally important function of exercising such institutional levers as may be required in order to make other parts of government work. Were those institutional levers being effectively operated by the Cabinet Secretary when you arrived in Downing Street in July 2019?
No, but I would also, obviously, it was the middle of the worst constitutional crisis in a century, and I certainly would be extremely unfair to blame the Cabinet Secretary for all the problems that we had at that time.
Throughout the rest of that year and at the beginning of 2020, did you discern any improvement in the structural system concerning the Cabinet Office?
In some ways, yes, I think it did improve. On the very first day that I arrived, I sent an email to the Cabinet Secretary regarding how I thought that Brexit should work in terms of the Brexit, what became known as XS, Brexit Strategy and Brexit Operations, XO. The Cabinet Secretary agreed with me. We set that up. I think almost everybody involved with the process thinks that it radically improved how the government dealt with such an extremely complicated question. And I think also everybody that I know who I spoke to about it thinks that, contrary to the impression that one often gets in the media, in fact, going through that admittedly nightmarish process of XO during 2019 actually proved extremely useful in terms of dealing with the COVID crisis. So overall, I would say, I did say to the Prime Minister in December 2019 as the election was ending, overall the system is completely dysfunctional. But within that, the Cabinet Secretary did make various important improvements, I think.
Do you think your description of your colleagues, the way in which you described them, their functions, their abilities, their talents, added to that dysfunctionality?
No, I think the opposite. I think my job, a huge part of the problem of the culture of Westminster and Whitehall that was so disastrous in COVID is people not speaking out about core problems. And I regarded my job as, I'm not a very smart person, I'm not a specialist in all sorts of ways, but I had built very effective teams. And I felt that a crucial part of my job was to say to the PM and to other people, if I thought that someone couldn't do the job, then to make that clear, because A, that's so fundamental to performance, and B, the issue is so often buried in Whitehall.
On the 3rd of May, so after the initial crisis and the first wave...
3rd of what, sorry?
3rd of May 2020, INQ 253940, you sent an email to Martin Reynolds, the Principal Private Secretary, Stuart Glasborough, Claire Brunton, Imran Shafi, the Private Secretary for Health Matters, Education and other policies, Hannah Young and Emily Binion, as well as Munir Mirza, and you copied it back to yourself. You said, we're wasting far too much time in crap meetings. We're not using the PM's time well. Changes from tomorrow. No papers go to PM on anything related to COVID-19, including from Cabinet Office and HMT, unless they're cleared by Shinner. That's Tom Shinner?
Yes.
Or me, nobody else. Any chair brief and anything related to COVID-19 must be cleared by Shinner or me, nobody else. And then there are some further directions concerning papers for prime ministerial meetings. Shinner, hire whoever else you think you need. 5, we must start cancelling meetings and telling the PM. And so on.
Mm-hmm.
Did that direction that nothing would go to the Prime Minister on COVID from the Cabinet Office and HMT include anything from the Cabinet Secretary?
You mean, did that mean that the Cabinet Secretary could not write directly to the Prime Minister?
Unless cleared by you or Tom Shinner?
No.
So who was being excluded, in effect, within the civil service from communicating papers to the Prime Minister without your intervention?
So essentially what I was trying to do here, the actually quote, or me, unquote, is actually not really very relevant. What I was actually trying to do was empower Tom Shinner, who is an excellent official. We had a fundamental problem, well, we had many fundamental problems. The two most obvious ones were the Cabinet Office was a bomb site, and we had a huge problem of quality control of documents going into meetings, and inconsistent data, inconsistent facts being read out. And many officials have come to me and said, this is causing chaos. There has to be some formalised system to actually grip this, because the Cabinet Office was a dumpster fire and Shinner was extremely able. Essentially what I was trying to do here was say, there has to be someone who actually takes responsibility for saying that they and a team have checked the information and are certifying that it's accurate, so that we would get away from these nightmare meetings that we'd had all the way through the previous few weeks of documents coming up, people then saying this is wrong, this is out of date, everyone looking at each other like the Spider-Man meme, not being clear who's actually responsible. So I was trying to say, let's actually establish a proper structure for this with someone who everybody respected.
Tom Shinner was, like you, an advisor with the civil service to the Prime Minister.
With respect, he was not really like me, no.
He was an advisor insofar as he was not a member of the civil service. He was an advisor to the Prime Minister.
No, with respect, that's not correct.
What was he?
He had been an official. He then left. He then came back in as an official. I think he was, well, to begin with, his exact status was slightly unclear, obviously, for the first few days, because he arrived on the 16th of March.
Did you bring him in?
He was a civil servant, not an advisor.
Did you bring him in, Mr. Cummings?
I did.
Was it wise, in hindsight, to concentrate this degree of control in yourself and Mr. Shinner?
I think bringing Tom in and empowering him the way I did was one of the probably handful of best decisions I made in the whole nightmare. And by the way, the Cabinet Secretary strongly agreed with me. I think he'd worked with Tom Shinner on a lot of Brexit issues and with Jeremy Haywood a few years earlier. So it wasn't like I was imposing this on them. I actually spoke to Mark and said, here's my idea. Are you happy with it? And he said, yeah, it sounds great, sounds great.
On the 15th of May, according to your statement, you had a long discussion with the private office in Downing Street to review what had gone wrong with the Cabinet Office. You raised issues about lack of coordination across Whitehall, the duplication of requests, in essence, a failure to grip whatever issues or problems confronted the Cabinet Office. What was your view of the private office within Downing Street with whom you were having those conversations?
I think the private office, as I made clear in my statement, was in all sorts of ways absolutely excellent, and I think it had some of the finest public servants in the whole system. I think the country was lucky to have them. I think, though, that there was, I would say that there was one very obvious problem, which was that apart from the leadership of the private office, he was a notable exception. But there was a core problem, which is that private secretaries in the Prime Minister's office are generally quite junior officials. Quite a few of them are young women. And at that meeting on the 15th of May and on other occasions, some of the young women in the private office said to me that they thought that there was a serious problem with senior people in the Cabinet Office not paying attention to what they were saying, talking over them, generally just a bad culture of a lot of the senior male leadership in the Cabinet Office, which was something which I agreed with.
Well, we'll be looking in due course at some of your emails and texts to other members of the team. Is it fair to say that you were critical also of the private office? That you sent emails and texts saying the private office is systemically flawed in certain regards, as well as the Cabinet Office?
So I think there's two separate things. I was generally highly impressed by the private secretaries in the private office, who I thought did an absolutely extraordinary job. But I thought that the overall structure in which the private office operated clearly didn't work. And, you had a relatively tiny number of people with, as I say, relatively junior people suddenly being completely swamped by being asked to solve huge numbers of problems from all across the system. So when I say the private office didn't work, it wasn't that this is not a criticism of most of the people in it. It's that it was swamped by the broader dysfunction of the Cabinet Office.
Could we have, please, the letter that you sent to the inquiry, 48313 at page 56? This, I think, is if we go back to the previous page, thank you very much. We can see this as an email you sent on Monday, the 13th of July, right at the bottom of the page. It's a lengthy email, isn't it, Mr. Cummings, in which you set out your views on a number of different parts of the government machine.
Yes.
There had been for some time, you'd raised the issue in January of the overall structure of the government. You'd raised it again in May. You had repeatedly returned to this subject, and you returned to it in July. Over the page, on page 57, there are references to the Cabinet Office not working for anyone in the second paragraph.
Yeah.
Further down the page, you are critical, it's about halfway down, of COBRA and CCS. Is CCS the Civil Contingency Secretariat, and how it failed in multiple ways?
Yeah.
You are critical of the data system, correct?
Yep.
Over the page, page 59, you are critical of institutional friction, turf wars, the existence of blame games. Page 60, you refer to bloating, a copy list culture. 61, we've experienced disaster, the PM has said sort it out. We're still a low-performing entity while dealing with the next phase of COVID and economic horror. We need a timetable for key actions. Simon and Tom should informally scout out possible key people for this now. Was there any part of the government machine, Mr. Cummings, in which you did not find fault?
Well, in summer 2020, I spent quite a lot of time talking to British Special Forces, and I found that they were exceptional.
Well, now, Mr. Cummings, you know perfectly well that this is evidence directed at the coronavirus pandemic, and we are debating the mechanics of number 10, the Cabinet Office, and the government response.
They were isolated, so if you're asking purely about the number 10 and the Cabinet Office system...
I'm talking about the structure concerned with the response to the coronavirus pandemic.
So I would say overall, widespread failure, but pockets of excellent people and pockets of excellent teams doing excellent work within an overall dysfunctional system.
In your statement, you describe how, following this email, the Prime Minister, whilst initially agreeing with the sentiment of your trenchant views on aspects of the government machine, listened to use your word, pop-ins, and then got cold feet. What are pop-ins?
So obviously the context for this document comes after 8 weeks of a nightmare situation kicked off by the PM.
I do apologise, Mr. Cummings. What are pop-ins?
Pop-ins are what people in private office refer to when the Prime Minister would make a decision about something. Some element of the system, often in the Cabinet Office, would not like what had been agreed. And in the best Sir Humphrey Westminster style, they would wait for me and other people to not be around the Prime Minister, and they would pop in to see the Prime Minister and say, "Dear Prime Minister, I think that this decision really wasn't the best idea. Very brave Prime Minister. Perhaps you should trolley on it." And this was a general problem.
You should trolley on it. Meaning?
Well, I'm still using the sort of generic term that we often used about the PM.
The term you used and his Cabinet Secretary used and his Director of Communications used and other officials, no doubt, about his propensity to...
Pretty much everyone called him the trolley, yeah.
...change direction. Cobra...
If you're moving on, Mr. Keith, I appreciate that it's a little early, but I think we've had quite a long stint for...
Yes, indeed.
And Mr. Cummings, like me, does speak very quickly. So I think we'll take a break now. I shall return at 1:45.
Thank you.
All right.
OK, we're just wrapping up for lunch there. The first session promised to be explosive, and by Jove, it certainly was right from the first off. Mr. Cummings, has to be said, at least he wore a shirt and tie, Emily, not a scarf and a hat. But straight away, the big points for me were who was in power.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
he said there almost certainly it was not the Cabinet. The Cabinet Secretary, he said at the time, was Mark Sedwill, was 100 times more powerful than anybody other than the Prime Minister, an unelected bureaucrat running the country in our darkest hours, not the Cabinet. Of course, apologies again for some very choice language, but that was a direct readout of some of the WhatsApp messages that were exchanged. Emily.
And the man asking the questions was Hugo Keith KC, and he read at the beginning quotes from a statement given from Cummings where he said Cabinet was largely irrelevant to policy or execution in 2020. So that's a big statement there, because the Cabinet, they are elected to run the country. But yet he says the Cabinet Secretary, civil servant, had more power over crucial decisions that were made. Of course, he said a lot of negative things about the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and his handling of the situation there, talking of, well, we get the impression that it was chaotic,
yes,
disorganised. He also spoke about misogyny in parts of the government.
Interesting how he said, of course, that everybody, pretty much everybody, he said by this point, referred to Boris Johnson as the trolley. And to repeat, that meant somebody who changed direction randomly and without notice, like a supermarket trolley would just kind of veer off its course. Cummins agreed that the public deserved better from ministers who, he said, routinely failed. What came out of, well, for me, Emily, was a real culture, just a bedlam on the specific issue of were any minutes or recordings of these meetings held. Cummins said, I don't recall. The only record seems to be the WhatsApp messages, and we know that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson's, were automatically deleted after 7 days. Therefore, we have a process of everything being classified, everything being secretised because they were scared of what would come out. All the records entirely missing altogether.
Yes, and this, of course, what Dominic Cummings is saying today is very much his view, his perspective on those months where he was essentially the Prime Minister's right-hand man. We know they are now sworn enemies, or appear to be, in many ways. He described the Cabinet Office as a bomb site and a dumpster fire. That's what the COVID inquiry heard today. So very, very strong language. Of course, there was even more strong language, coarse language, used with regard to WhatsApp messages. He said, yes, it was coarse language, but that was the mood, and other people shared that mood with him, that feeling.
It seems like generally a landscape of chaos, a coarse language landscape, and it just, I think, is going to be a dumpster fire for the rest of the day. Plenty more to come after the lunch break, but for now, here's your latest news bulletins with Sophia.
Good afternoon, it's 1:03. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. A public health catastrophe in Gaza is now imminent, according to the World Health Organization. The mass displacement of people, coupled with the damage to water and sanitation services, is creating a dire situation for residents. It comes as Israel's Prime Minister dismissed calls for a ceasefire in the war against Hamas, saying that it would mean surrendering to terrorism. More than 8,300 people have been killed by Israeli attacks in Gaza. Rishi Sunak's government has been clear on its support for Israel, but is urging for a humanitarian pause in the fighting to get aid into Gaza. Sir Keir Starmer has reaffirmed Labour's support for a humanitarian pause in the Israel-Hamas war. Speaking a short time ago, the Labour leader said it was the only credible approach to the ongoing conflict, but he argued that a permanent ceasefire could risk more violence in the region, giving Hamas a chance to carry out more attacks.
At every stage during this crisis, my approach has been driven by the need to respond to both these tragedies, to stand by the right to self-defence of any nation which suffers terrorism on this scale, alongside the basic human rights of innocent Palestinians caught once again in the crossfire.
Now, the COVID-19 inquiry has heard that Dominic Cummings warned Boris Johnson of big problems due to insufficiencies in the Cabinet Office. The inquiry heard that Mr Cummings told the former Prime Minister in a WhatsApp message that the Cabinet Office are useless and the then Health Secretary Matt Hancock is a proven liar. He served as Boris Johnson's chief advisor until he was forced to quit in 2020 for breaking lockdown rules. Lee Kane, who was the Director of Communications, spoke of a lack of leadership and said Mr Johnson should have done more during the pandemic's early phase. The government has called off plans to close train ticket offices. The Transport Secretary asked train operators a short time ago to withdraw the controversial proposal to shut offices in England. A public consultation launched to gauge public opinion on the closure received the largest ever response, with the RMT union saying most people opposed the closures. Mark Harper says the proposals didn't meet the high thresholds of serving rail passengers. There's more relief on the way today for households feeling the pinch from the rising cost of living. Those eligible will receive a payment of £300, the second in a series of support packages. The money will be deposited into the bank accounts of people on certain benefits and will have no impact on existing benefits. More than 8 million households will be helped by the cost of living payments. Police in Paris have shot and critically wounded a woman at a metro station after she was heard threatening passengers with jihadist slogans. The woman was wearing a hijab and a full body veil and behaved aggressively, according to the French government. The shooting comes as France is on its highest state of alert following the murder of a school teacher in a suspected Islamic terrorist attack earlier this month. Flooding has hit parts of Northern Ireland, with people warned to avoid travel. Storm Ciarán is bringing strong winds and heavy rain to the UK. Parts of Newry in the County Down have been left underwater after a canal burst its banks, with water levels in the city at unprecedented levels. The Met Office has issued a yellow rain across Northern Ireland for tonight until tomorrow morning, warning some communities may be cut off by flooding.
Anybody who's lived here, as I have for generations, we had flooding in 47, there was flooding in 63. These events have occurred in the past, but we need to work together to try and mitigate the impact of them. And with modern technology and modern ways of managing floodwater, of course, we can introduce schemes that can assist in that process.
And pomp and pageantry were on full display this morning as the King and Queen touched down in Kenya for a state visit. Their Majesties were greeted in Nairobi by Kenyan President William Ruto. It's the King's first visit as monarch to the country where his mother became Queen in 1952. The King paid his respects to Kenya's fallen heroes, military and civilian, at the tomb of the unknown warrior. He also visited a model farm which serves as an information centre for the local community and provides food for the hospital. This is GB News across the UK, on TV, in your car, on your digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Martin and Emily.
Well, it's already an explosive afternoon. Dominic Cummings has launched a scathing attack on the government's record during the COVID-19 pandemic as he appeared today before the inquiry.
Yes, calling the Cabinet Office a bomb site, remarking that important decisions were taken away from Cabinet and that the government was a mix of the wrong people in the wrong jobs. Strong stuff. The former chief advisor pulled no punches as he unloaded on Boris Johnson's tenure as Prime Minister. But should we take it with a pinch of salt? Let's ask Deputy Political Editor Tom Harwood, who is outside the inquiry and has been listening very carefully to what was said. As I said there, Tom, what have we learned, and should we take Dominic Cummings' testimony with a pinch of salt?
Honestly, there were sharp intakes of breaths from other journalists just inside moments ago as the COVID lawyer read out the words F-pigs and C-words to describe Dominic Cummings' descriptions of senior government ministers. He was asked, was that a particularly productive thing to do? And Dominic Cummings replied, saying that it reflected the general sentiment of many people in government, the disdain that he had for many sitting around the cabinet table, and indeed many senior civil servants as well were in for his ire, particularly those running the Cabinet Office, a body within government that Dominic Cummings described as a dumpster fire and a bomb site. It seemed there were very few areas of the mechanisms of government that Dominic Cummings would say were working, frankly, through the summer of 2019 and into 2020, describing how he attempted to promote certain people he viewed as able and, frankly, remove people he thought were unable. But in the structure of everything as well, Dominic Cummings saying that this was simply a structure of government that did not work.
And Tom, another revelation that came out was a culture of classifying everything to hide mistakes and scrutiny. The notion that cabinet minutes weren't even kept in some of the most important meetings in recent British history. So therefore, the accountability afterwards is complete and utter bedlam, isn't it?
Certainly, but more than that, the most senior meetings were not amongst the cabinet. We heard from Dominic Cummings confirmation of something that has been widely understood for several decades now, that decisions aren't made around the cabinet table. They're made within senior groups of advisors and the Prime Minister himself within number 10. Dominic Cummings described the cabinet as a Potemkin exercise, pretending to make decisions, walking down Downing Street for the cameras, all for show, when actually the decisions were made by a far smaller group at meetings that occurred at either 8:15 or 9:15 that were not minuted. And he was speaking about those small groups of advisors making decisions and saying that at one point he advised Boris Johnson in the final week of the 2019 general election campaign to cut the cabinet down back to the size it was 100 years ago, saying it was impossible to make decisions with a group of 25 or 30 people sitting around that cabinet table, impossible to make those decisions or have constructive conversations without it leaking. He also was deeply critical of Boris Johnson's ability to chair those cabinet discussions, almost referring to the cabinet as something that was useless and for show, again pointing to much smaller meetings of people that most people would never have heard of making the crucial decisions that affect our lives.
Tom, just very quickly, a few of our viewers and listeners are asking who is in that room in the COVID inquiry besides Dominic Cummings and the KC? Who is there listening in the background?
Well, I'm up in a press room that's slightly different from the actual room in which everything is happening. In the press room, we've got a transcript that the stenographers are rapidly typing out and some other resources. But in the room, only a small handful of 4 journalists can sit at any one time. And once you leave, if you're in there, you can't then go back in until there's a break. And of course, there are these periodic breaks. We're in one now. Things are returning at 1:45. But within the room, it is, of course, the lawyers from the inquiry, the stenographers, and, of course, Dominic Cummings as well. That's generally the setup here. And it is interesting to really see the forensic detail with which the lawyers are going at their questioning. They've read these mammoth submissions that the people being questioned have submitted to the inquiry. And the questioning sessions, as people will have probably been able to work out, are going through particular areas of those submissions that have already been put before the inquiry.
And Tom, as well as criticising the size of the cabinet, Dominic Cummings was criticising the usefulness at all. He was saying here the cabinet secretary was 100 times more powerful than anybody other than the Prime Minister, putting into view the very serious notion that in our darkest hours of lockdowns, the people in charge of the country, they weren't even elected. They were unelected bureaucrats.
Certainly, and we must emphasise at this point, it wasn't just the people around the cabinet table that Dominic Cummings had great criticism for. It was also the people leading the cabinet office, particularly the cabinet secretary Mark Sedwill, who was mentioned by Dominic Cummings in the interview, in the interrogation really, as someone who was basically useless in his job. Dominic Cummings described him as an able diplomat, but someone who simply did not have a grip on how the cabinet office worked. People did not know who were making which decisions, and indeed even the documents being submitted to senior politicians from the cabinet office were muddled and inconsistent, and frankly, in the words of Dominic Cummings, a dumpster fire. So he really did not hold back from criticism, not just of politicians, as we've heard a lot of, but also of some senior civil servants and the ability of people in very crucial roles. Many of those roles, as Dominic Cummings described, many of those civil servants, many times, 10 times, 100 times more powerful than the cabinet ministers that we may well know the names of at home.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom Harwood, there with a single lone protester behind him with a sign there saying "callous liar." Presumably that's referring to Boris Johnson, or it could be referring to Dominic Cummings. Who knows? Thank you very much indeed, Tom Harwood, our deputy political editor outside the COVID inquiry.
Or indeed both of them, and they are currently breaking for lunch. We expect that to be around about an hour, although they do look a long lunch in Westminster. But we will be going back to the COVID inquiry for more later. Tom Harwood there throughout the afternoon. We will not miss a beat of the horror show on Halloween.
Yes, it is Halloween. So Sir Keir Starmer says now is not the right time for a ceasefire in the Middle East, claiming it would embolden Hamas and risk further violence immediately.
In a speech in central London, the Labour leader said a humanitarian pause is the only credible approach to the conflict in Gaza, calling it terrorism and brutality on a scale few countries have ever experienced.
Yes, meanwhile, the World Health Organization has warned a public health catastrophe is imminent in Gaza amid overcrowding and the breakdown of vital services, including access to clean water.
And we can speak now to Mark Redyev, Senior Advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister. Thank you for joining us on GB News. First of all, strong words from your Prime Minister. You'll never surrender to Hamas, quoting the Bible. This is a time for war. This despite the fact there has been serious pressure from the United Nations. Can you tell us the latest about Israel's resolve to fight Hamas?
Well, resolve is exactly the right word. We are committed to getting this done. Israelis, frankly, refuse to live next to this ISIS, Hamas enclave on our southern border. That's clearly not sustainable. We refuse to go through the sort of attacks we've had to undergo over the last few weeks. We will never experience again what we did on October 7th, and we'll put an end to this terror kingdom on our southern border. We are committed to destroying Hamas, and at the same time, we are committed to providing civilian population of Gaza with humanitarian aid, and we're working very closely with the international community to do that. Our enemy is the Hamas military machine. We do not target the innocent population of Gaza.
Mark, are you concerned, great to speak to you, are you concerned with the groundswell of support for Palestine, for the residents of Gaza? There's huge pressure at the moment and the volume is getting louder and louder, calling for a ceasefire, calling for Israel to stop the bombardment of Gaza.
For us in Israel, it's a matter of life and death. We saw what Hamas did to us just 3 weeks ago. We saw their brutality. We saw that horror in all. We saw it close up. That they raped, they beheaded, they burnt people alive. Frankly, they burnt babies alive. The young people at the open-air concert were driven into a ridge and were machine gunned. It reminded us of terrible moments in Jewish history from the 20th century. It was a terrible, horrific event. And we are determined to put an end to this terrorism on our southern border. Now, if people can't understand that, I don't know what else to say. We saw, in the words of the German Chancellor, Scholz, we saw Nazi-type violence. These people butchered, massacred. How can anyone even justify their behaviour?
Yeah.
And Mark, there have been calls from America, for example, for a more laser-targeted approach, air fire, and then special forces going in. But your tactics of going in on the ground have yielded results, haven't they, with the extraction of at least one hostage, Private Ori Megadish, overnight. So are you confident that your approach is the correct one?
Look, we're always happy to listen to the words of friends, whether they're friends in London or friends in Washington. We want to target and destroy Hamas's terrorist capabilities. We want to end their political control over the Gaza Strip. We think that's good for us. I think it's also good for Palestinians to be rid of this terrible, terrible regime that have governing them. But we want to be as surgical as is possible. We want to destroy Hamas. And at the same time, we're working with allies and friends and on this humanitarian corridor in the south so that Gazan civilians who vacated the north, who to avoid the fighting can find a zone of safety in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, close to the Mediterranean coast and closer to the Rafah crossing with Egypt, though they're close to the humanitarian supplies that are coming in.
Mark, we understand that there are still over 200 hostages, Israeli hostages, being held by Hamas. Concern is growing over their safety and security, of course. How are the Israeli forces going about retrieving these hostages? They must, frankly, be terrified.
So you're correct. This is a major problem. And to all those people who had a ceasefire, I'd asked them after Boko Haram abducted and kidnapped an even larger amount of schoolgirls. You'll recall that a few years ago. Did anyone call for a ceasefire with Boko Haram? Ridiculous. Hamas has declared war on all civilization in their behavior, and we have to destroy them. Any ceasefire just protects Hamas from Israel's counterstrike, and that's wrong. Of course, we have to do more to support the civilian population, and we are doing more. On your question, they're holding these hostages. We will continue to try to free the people we can, to rescue the ones we can reach. At the same time, we think the way to get them out is to keep beefing up the pressure, ratchet up the pressure on Hamas, force them to feel the pain. Maybe we'll get more concessions and people released that way.
OK, Mark Regev, thank you for joining us on the live desk. Superb stuff. Let's move on now and let's go to Mark White, live from us in Tel Aviv. Mark, we just heard there from Mark Regev, senior advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu. The resolve seems strong. They said they will not stop until they have wiped out Hamas.
Yeah, and they still have a job to do. They know that because Hamas still has significant capability. There have been multiple rocket attacks launched at Israeli civilian communities today. The last one just about 15 minutes ago, a large barrage here into Tel Aviv. We could hear very significant booms from the Iron Dome missile system as those missiles went into the air to intercept those rockets. Now, there are some reports circulating on social media suggesting that there have been a number of hits in the northeast of Tel Aviv, about 28 minutes or so drive from where we are. There is a video that's circulating. We're not going to show you that at the moment because we're just trying to gauge the accuracy of that video. It's the only one, the only video that's out there at the moment. And normally if there was rocket impacts, there would be multiple videos coming out fairly quickly. So that just rings the odd alarm bell. So we'll just try and bottom that out. But what we can tell you is a significant rocket attack on Tel Aviv within the last 15 minutes with the sound of explosions from the rocket interceptors of the Iron Dome missile defense system going supersonic and then hitting those rockets over Tel Aviv as well. And this comes, you know, just a couple of hours after the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, was giving his support to Israel in a sense, saying that he is not calling for a ceasefire, but on the other hand, saying that he does want humanitarian pauses, that the toll on innocent civilians in Gaza is very significant indeed, and that humanitarian pauses are required to try to get more in the way of aid trucks in. Incidentally, we've been told that there may be about 80 or so aid trucks going into Gaza today. Some have already been checked, but we're not sure how many have entered Gaza as yet. The Israelis have said that they are willing to countenance the idea of humanitarian safe zones to allow these aid trucks to come in and to unload all of the aid to be distributed throughout southern Gaza in particular, which is where the bulk of the population has now moved to. Having said that, there are still hundreds of thousands of people in the north that have either refused to leave or are prevented from leaving, or actually are just not in a position to leave because they're elderly, infirm, or they're sick in hospitals. We've also, as the ground war continues, it's pushing further and further into northern Gaza, coming under, we're told, very heavy fire from Hamas terrorists in entrenched positions. The IDF say they're taking out those positions slowly but surely and continuing to advance. There was what we can only describe as a very stirring speech, I guess, from an IDF commander to his troops in the tanks waiting in northern Gaza to push forward. This is what he said just a little earlier this morning.
Southern Command Forces, this is the commander. We are striking Hamas and the terrorist organisations in the Gaza Strip. We have one goal, victory. No matter how long or how hard the fighting will be, there is no other outcome than victory. We will fight with professionalism and strength, based first and foremost on the IDF values which were instilled in us, dedication to mission and the pursuit of victory. We will fight in alleys, we will fight in tunnels, we will fight wherever necessary.
Well, thank you, Mark. And closer to home here in Paris, you brought us earlier the very latest from Paris, the Paris metro station, where police shot an unarmed woman wearing an Islamic veil who had reportedly been threatening to blow herself up while shouting Allahu Akbar. What do we know?
Well, I think you've just about said most of what occurred, but I think this just comes against a backdrop of a heightened terror threat across the West. In particular, we've had a number of terrorist incidents of late that have been linked to the conflict here in Israel, and that one in Paris. We know that this woman is critically ill in hospital at this hour. They have not, as far as we know, found any kind of improvised explosive device. But then again, those police officers who opened fire weren't able to tell whether she did or she didn't, because she was wearing a full veil and was non-compliant with the officers. She was refusing to obey their commands.
OK, Mark White, live from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much for that latest update. OK, there's plenty more to come yet on GB News Live, and we'll see you shortly.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. Join me, Mark Dolan, Fridays and Saturdays from 9, Sundays from 10. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Can you be quiet? What is this? It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christys, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
It's 1:30 and I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB newsroom. Israel's Prime Minister has dismissed calls for a ceasefire in the war against Hamas as a ground assault on Gaza intensifies. Quoting the Bible, Benjamin Netanyahu said this is a time for war and that calls for a ceasefire would mean surrendering to terrorism. More than 8,300 people in Gaza have been killed by Israeli attacks. Rishi Sunak's government has been clear in its support of Israel, but is urging for a humanitarian pause in the fighting to get aid into Gaza. The COVID inquiry has heard Dominic Cummings warned Boris Johnson the Cabinet Office was totally behind pace and had no plan to deal with the pandemic. He also said the former Prime Minister was known as the shopping trolley due to his tendency to change direction. Mr Cummings served as Boris Johnson's chief advisor until he was forced to quit in 2020 for breaking lockdown rules. The inquiry is continuing this afternoon. Plans to close train ticket offices have been called off. The Transport Secretary asked train operators a short time ago to withdraw the controversial proposal. A public consultation on the closures received the largest ever response, with the RMT union saying most people opposed the plan. Mark Harper says it didn't meet the high threshold of serving rail passengers. Flooding has hit parts of Northern Ireland, with people warned to avoid travel. Storm Ciarán is bringing strong winds and heavy rain to the UK. Parts of Newry and County Down have been left underwater after a canal burst its banks, with water levels in the city at unprecedented levels. The Met Office has issued a yellow rain alert across Northern Ireland from tonight until tomorrow morning, warning some communities may be cut off by flooding. And you can get more on all those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
For a valuable legacy your family can own, gold coins will always shine bright. Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
And here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. A pound will buy you $1.2152 and €1.1446. The price of gold is £1,644 and 37 pence per ounce. And the FTSE 100's at 7,348 points.
Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Welcome back to GB News Live with me, Emily Carver and Martin Dobney. It is lunchtime for the COVID inquiry currently. We were just watching Dominic Cummings giving evidence to Hugo Keith KC. He was asking him many questions relating to a statement he gave and also asking fresh questions relating to WhatsApp messages where there was rather a lot of coarse language. Lots of key points coming across, weren't there?
That's right. We expected it to be a horror show on Halloween, and by Jove, Cummings did not pull any punches. Started off calling the situation a dumpster fire, a bomb site, but at least he was wearing a shirt and tie, not his usual kind of woolly hat. Regalia, some very, very coarse language in the opening, the sort which would make a squaddy's hair curl. It has to be said. But the key point for me was who was really in power. power. Dominic sparing no punches. The cabinet secretary, he said, was 100 times more powerful than anybody in government other than the Prime Minister. Emily clearly indicating that the cabinet, the elected cabinet, they were about as useful as a chocolate teapot.
Yes, that's what he had to say, at least. Certainly, the debate is raging in our inbox now. People asking who's in charge, who's running the country. Is it elected ministers, elected members of parliament or civil servants? Dominic Cummings certainly seems to think that the cabinet was not making the policy decisions during that time, at least. And lots of people getting in touch to say, can we take what Dominic Cummings is saying as gospel? Should we be taking it with a pinch of salt? They're also mentioning Barnard Castle, aren't they?
Yeah, of course. I mean, they're having a pop. Can we trust this? Is this a wronged lover, so to speak, an embittered former employer? They're on lunch at the moment. They do like a long lunch in Westminster, so we may be some time, but for sure we're going to be cutting back over to that. It promises to be an explosive afternoon of fresh revelations from the COVID inquiry.
Yes, I reckon they'll probably have about an hour for lunch, but we'll bring you back to that when we hear he is back in the inquiry. But food price inflation has fallen for the 6th month in a row, dropping to its lowest level in over a year. That's according to new figures from the British Retail Consortium and Nielsen IQ.
And it's strengthening the case for the Bank of England to keep the base rate of interest at 5.25% this week, ahead, of course, of their decision this Thursday.
Yes, so joining us in the studio is none other than Liam Halligan, our economics and business editor, with On the Money. Liam, good news.
It is good news. These aren't official numbers. These are numbers from the British Retail Consortium, but they're survey numbers. They're rather not numbers produced by the Office for National Statistics. Let's just have a look at where we are on inflation. These are the official numbers. If you can see here, I think we've got a graph that you can see. Well, if we haven't got the graph, well, there it is. Hey, presto, the magic of television. You see the peak of inflation there, up above 11.1% last October. Inflation has been coming down pretty steadily, not in a straight line. You see it's flatlined in the last few months, July, August and September, 6.8, 6.7, 6.7. Of course, way above the 2% target where it should be, but at least it's coming down. And then we have these British Retail Consortium numbers, and I can show you them now. So in September, the British Retail Consortium said inflation was 6.2%. This is from their surveys. They call it shop inflation, so it doesn't include services and things like that, or legal things, or it's what we experience when we go out to the supermarkets. In October, here's the new number, 5.2%, so a big drop. Now, we know the Bank of England's making its next decision on interest rates on Thursday. That's the 2nd of November. And then the next official inflation number for October, that comes out in the middle of November. So, look, this is good news. It suggests it's another reason why the Bank of England should hold interest rates on Thursday. Another reason that you won't have heard much about on the television, because it's a little bit technical, but I'll tell you about it. Because this is GB News, and we don't talk down to our viewers and listeners, do we? We think they can handle this.
Feel free to dumb it down a bit for us.
A little
for
bit.
Martin.
A little bit. So you have these things called monetary aggregates, and they're measures of the money supply in the economy. And it's not just cash, it's not even mostly cash. It's how quickly bank credit is expanding. And that's really important for inflation. And we know that not only isn't bank credit expanding, it's actually contracting. You could see that when I was talking about the mortgage numbers yesterday. Far fewer mortgages being extended than the same month than September last year. You've got less demand for credit from companies because they're worried about the future. They don't know if the demand for their product is going to be there. They don't want to go into debt because interest rates are high. And the Bank of England brought out some numbers earlier this week that showed the broad monetary aggregates really constricting now, and that is as near to a law as you get in economics, that when the monetary aggregates constrict, prices come down because there's just less demand in the economy. That is now happening. And given those monetary aggregates constricting, given these British Retail Consortium numbers, given the downward trend in inflation that I've showed you earlier in this discussion, I really would be surprised if the Bank of England didn't hold interest rates on Thursday at 5.25%. It held them last year. We've had 14 interest rate rises. Let them work through the system.
Well, Mystic Liam, you're normally right on these things, but before we get too excited about shop inflation, it just means that our stuff isn't going up in price as much as it used to.
That's right.
It's not coming down.
No, it's not coming down.
We're still getting poorer.
Prices are still going up, though wage inflation is higher than 6.2%. It's more like 7%. But, of course, that's on average. Not everyone gets a pay rise, do they? So it kind of depends where the cookie crumbles, as it were. But, look, this is good news. I don't think we're completely over this inflation surge. It may be that it gets worse when the winter comes. If there's lots of geopolitics, oil prices spike, I'd be irresponsible not to say that. But we do know that the Ofgem energy price cap came down from the beginning of this month, so that should mean that the October inflation number, when it does come out in the middle of November, will be lower than the current one, and that's another reason why the Bank of England should hold fire.
Just very quickly, if the Bank of England make the decision to keep the interest rate where it is,
5.25%,
at 5.25%, would we be an outlier? Are other countries still raising their interest rates?
We'll know. Great question, Emily. Tomorrow, the US of A will decide, the Federal Reserve will decide what happens with interest rates. Will it hold? I think it will. And if the Fed holds tomorrow, I mean, nothing in economics is ever certain, but it's as nailed on as it could be that the Bank of England will hold.
Because we sometimes follow their lead, don't we?
We often follow their lead on
Thursday.
Thursday.
There we go. Thank you, Liam. Liam Halligan, our economics editor.
Superb stuff. A nice optimistic note to end on there. You with GB News Live, and after the break, we'll be joined by a royal correspondent to look at the King and Queen's visit to Kenya. Don't go anywhere.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with you three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sundays at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back to GB News Live. It's 1:45. Now, the King and Queen have officially been welcomed in Nairobi at the start of the state's visit to Kenya, the first Commonwealth nation His Majesty has visited as sovereign.
And it's not without some controversy, but here to explain all is Cameron Walker, our royal correspondent here in the studio with me and Martin. So tell us, what's King Charles there for and what's happened so far?
Well, it's a very poignant visit for King Charles. Kenya, of course, is the place his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, went up to the treetops Safari Lodge as a princess, came down as queen in 1952. It's King Charles's first visit to a Commonwealth nation since becoming King Charles as well. And it's, of course, let's remember that it's the British government that sends the king on a state visit. So it's clearly their intention to strengthen relationships with Kenya diplomatically. It's an increasingly competitive place, that area of Africa. It's got influence, or reportedly from China, Russia and America as well, all competing for entrepreneurship and business and trade. So the British government really wanting to use King Charles's power of soft diplomacy.
We're just watching here the late Queen's visit to Kenya, I believe.
Yes, that is.
Black and white images.
Yes, so that's her just arriving in Kenya as Princess Elizabeth, and this is 1952. And that Safari Lodge I mentioned earlier, where she spent the night in, which is when King George VI, her father, sadly passed away and she became queen, that was burnt down 2 years later in what's called the Mau Mau uprising, which is a controversy for King Charles and the British government because ancestors of those who fought in the Mau Mau uprising were, amongst other things, white farmers were attacked because the people who created this uprising did not want Britain ruling Kenya. As a result of that, the British rulers, it's estimated, either killed, tortured or maimed around 90,000 Kenyans. That's according to the Kenyan Human Rights Watch. And their ancestors now want a formal apology from King Charles during this state visit and reparations. That is unlikely, in my view.
And it's interesting, Cameron, because back in 2013, the British government at the time, in Duncan Smith, agreed a package worth nearly £20 million in reparations for this. Is this business not done and dusted? As I understand it, Kenyan politicians want to move on.
Yeah, there was a High Court case back in 2013. At the time, the British government expressed regret and, as you said, paid out nearly £20 million to 5,000 elderly Kenyans who suffered this abuse from Kenyan rulers. But, of course, as you say, that was kind of done and dusted. But the Kenyan government, as we understand it, wishes to move on and really look to the future and building what's been described by Buckingham Palace as boosting mutual prosperity. And we've seen this today with His Majesty the King on a number of engagements. He's been speaking to young people in particular, young tech entrepreneurs. There is a huge skills gap here in the UK of tech, as we understand it, speaking to someone called Professor Chris Imafidon, who's an education expert here in the UK. He was at the Kenyan reception at Buckingham Palace last week speaking to King Charles, and he was saying that actually this is one of the benefits of the state's visits because the UK has an ageing population. Kenya has huge youth unemployment with a skill set which could potentially be useful to the UK. So that's just one example of King Charles shining a light on an issue which could benefit
King Charles negotiating our migration policy with Kenya.
It might be better off just doing a royal wave or two. But Kenya is a significant trading partner, Cameron. Two-way trade worth around £1.2 billion a year in the last year-on-year figures. So they're a significant trading partner. And this is the perfect kind of soft diplomacy, the trade allegiance that the royal family should be doing.
Absolutely. And defence as well, a massive thing that we're going to be seeing over the next few days, particularly in Mombasa. The King, as we understand it, is going to be watching a demonstration of a beach landing conducted by British Marines and Kenyan Marines, because British Armed Forces do help train Kenyan Armed Forces in the region. So that's something, again, that King Charles will be shining a light on.
Well, will you be keeping an eye on everything that happens over the next...
Certainly will.
This is a 4-day visit,
yes,
isn't it, Cameron?
keeps me on my toes.
It does keep you on your toes. I believe we are ready to... Oh, can we ask you one more question, Cameron? Seeing as we've got you here, what kind of other things might happen? Will there be a banquet dinner? Will there be some pomp and ceremony?
There's always a banquet.
Yeah, there's always a banquet. That's happening tonight. So we've had the pomp and pageantry of the ceremonial welcome at the State House in Nairobi this morning with Kenyan Armed Forces playing the national anthems, etc. Tonight, there is going to be a state banquet. During that state banquet, King Charles will be delivering a speech, and that is where he is expected to give a nod to the Mau Mau uprising and what and the things.
OK, Cameron, thank you very much. We have to leave it there. From the banquet to Kenya, they've just finished lunch in London, and we're now going back to the COVID inquiry as we understand it.
Limitations on how COBRA worked entirely properly because of the requirement to keep the physical area secure from Russia and China and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
That was one...
So that's a practical consideration.
Yes. Also, it just didn't scale. So it was used to dealing with relatively small things like floods, like terrorist attack with 5 people getting killed or something like that. But with a crisis like this, which is much more on the scale of a war, it was just, it just couldn't, physically it couldn't function, data-wise it couldn't function, all the systems going in and out of it didn't scale.
Was the Prime Minister rather averse to attending COBRA on account of its physical location?
It's hard to say. I mean, he certainly preferred to be in his study, and he didn't like going to COBRA. I deliberately put the, so as I referred to earlier on, when we created the XS and XO structure, I deliberately put that in COBRA so that there were kind of live screens on the wall. We could record action notes in real time. It was just a more effective way of handling the ministers and handling the decision making. He wasn't enormously keen on it, no.
Right. COBRA was still used from March 2020 onwards, despite the institution of the 9:15 daily meetings in Downing Street. Was an important part of the continuation of the COBRA system the fact that it allowed the devolved administrations to take part in the process?
Correct. I mean, my sort of impression / memory is that from roughly speaking mid-March, the main function of COBRA after that was actually the sort of the process, rather Potemkin process of handling the DAs. In fact, I'm not sure if I even went back to COBRA for COVID after something like the 12th or 15th of March.
You ran down the COBRA system, Mr. Cummings, because your view was that with the devolved administrations party to that process, there was an unacceptable risk of leaks. You were violently opposed to the fact that the media was briefed afterwards, and you were against, therefore, the continued use of COBRA as a crisis resolution machinery.
I'd say that that's overstating things. So first of all, I didn't have the authority to run it down and didn't run it down. I think it's more accurate to say that it was superseded by broader things. It was superseded by the 8:15 meeting that I started, the 9:15 meeting, how those two meetings evolved into the COVID task force. So I didn't run it down. It continued, and I'm sure in some ways it did a very useful work. And also, it's important to point out, unlike other parts of the system that I've been very critical of, the people who ran COBRA, in my opinion, did an extremely professional job. The problem was not, in this instance, similar to the Cabinet Office, where a lot of the people were unsuitable. The problem here was a much more structural one, that the COBRA thing just didn't scale to what was needed.
Could we have page 22, please, of your letter to the inquiry, 48313? This is a message, a WhatsApp between yourself and Mr. Johnson, dated the 12th of March 2020.
Sorry, sir, it hasn't popped up. I can't see.
It'll come.
If it's important.
th of March 2020. You need to chair daily meetings in the cabinet room, not Cobra. On this from tomorrow, I'm going to tell the system this, not capital letters with the DAs on the fucking phone all the time either, so people can't tell you the truth. Well, you did run down the Cobra system, Mr. Cummings. You thought that if the Cobra system continued, people either wouldn't tell the truth or the devolved administrations would leak to the media or brief the media thereafter.
So I certainly thought that the Cobra meetings that we'd had with the PM were very Potemkin, they were extremely scripted, and then having had these sort of pointless things, you then had all sorts of people running straight out and yabbering to the media about what had just been said in a completely undisciplined way, which then undermined public confidence in things, caused a lot of trouble. But with respect, I wouldn't say this is running down the Cobra system. The Cobra system continued. What I was saying was that it was clearly completely unable to cope with the scale of the crisis and that a different system needed to be created. Just one very simple thing. We literally couldn't show the PM crucial data in the Cobra room because it couldn't be piped through because of the strap restrictions.
Well, you're going back now to the practical considerations and the practical difficulties of which you spoke earlier. Could we have 174673? Page 1, this is an email between yourself, I think Helen McNamara and others, dated the 13th of March. Your email is in the middle of the page. The PM view and mine on those Cobras is that they are hopeless as decision-making entities and actively cause trouble for comms, given they just brief immediately. So there you're focusing not on the practical difficulties of data or the national security restrictions over the use of the room, but because you thought they were hopeless as decision-making entities and they caused trouble for comms.
Yes.
On the 15th of March, in a WhatsApp thread, number 10 action, 236371, page 52, this is a WhatsApp sent after Mark Sedwell, now Lord Sedwell, the Cabinet Secretary, had produced a note to the Prime Minister concerning the committee structure moving forward, the institution of something called ministerial implementation groups and the 915 meetings. PM, it would be good if you could sign off the note from Mark Sedwell on moving to the next phase, structures, etc., ideally before the meeting this PM, so we could get things moving on that. Dominic Cummings, can you send on WhatsApp my work computer battery flat? I can't recharge for an hour. The draft I saw looked okay, as it was basically drafted by us. Who is us?
I'm not sure exactly, but some combination, I think, of me, Imran, Ben Warner.
Except it's still too keen on Cobras with DAs. The PM daily meetings must be in the cabinet room with spider phones and screens, not in Cobra where nobody can take laptops and phones. So there is a clear reference to the practical considerations, but also you were not keen on the devolved administrations being concerned in and attending Cobra.
No, that's not. They're different issues. If you're having meetings to actually figure out the truth, then meetings like that have to be conducted in a very different way. They can't be one of these things with 50 people on a video conference with the DAs when things immediately... Those DA meetings were not meetings to try to figure out the truth about hard issues. They were meetings as part of the kind of performance and coordination and the constitutional function. And my concern was that even at this late stage in the crisis, a lot of people in the Cabinet Office were still fixated on the kind of Potemkin, maintaining the Potemkin aspects rather than actually getting to the heart of things. And we couldn't get to the heart of things in that room because you literally couldn't take in the information and show it to the PM and have a proper discussion about it.
Why did you want Michael Gove to be in charge of regular devolved administration updates and not the Prime Minister?
I thought Gove would handle it 10 times better.
Handle what 10 times better?
Handle the process of dealing with the DAs. And also, bear in mind that as I said before, the whole XSXO structure, Michael Gove had more experience of anybody.
Slow down, please, Mr. Cummings.
Michael Gove had more experience of anybody in that room, the Cobra briefing room, because he was in there literally daily from July, August, September, etc., all the way through 2019. So I knew that he understood the whole rhythm, the process, the structure, the staff, and it just seemed like an obvious sort of way of divvying up responsibilities.
Mr. Gove was the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, was he not?
Yeah.
Was he the Prime Minister?
Was he what, sorry?
Was he the Prime Minister?
Obviously not.
No. Did you not want the Prime Minister to be in a meeting room with the devolved administrations, the constituent parts of the United Kingdom?
I thought it preferable to have the Prime Minister actually focused on the impending catastrophe that we faced on that day. And I thought that, generally speaking, him talking to the DAs did not advance any cause.
The devolved administrations had an entitlement, surely, to be able to confer with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in the face of this unprecedented crisis.
They did, and they did confer, but generally speaking, it was better for them to confer either with officials or with Michael Gove than with the PM.
Was number 10 any better? You describe it as a hopeless structure for dealing with a major crisis. What did you mean by that?
I mean, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into.
Well, be succinct, please, Mr. Cummings. Why was it a hopeless structure?
Well, number 10 is not configured to be the nerve centre of a national crisis like COVID.
Because of the absence of personnel or the absence of structure that allows people in number 10 to liaise with all the other parts of government?
In every way, physically, in terms of in terms of the physical layout, and the lack of the proper rooms that you would have for a crisis centre, in terms of the personnel, in terms of the power, as I've tried to explain. Real power on these things is almost entirely in the Cabinet Office, not in number 10. So number 10 was just completely unsuitable for this. That's why I tried to change it in January and try to change it again in the summer.
In paragraph 301, you say, as with the Cabinet Office, its problems and lack of specialist skills combined with its responsibility for human resources and recruitment, there were problems with the number 10 structure. You brought in friends or colleagues, Tom Shinner, who may have been a member of the civil service, but he was also an advisor, Mark and Ben Warner, Demis Hassabis. Why didn't you approach the relevant parts of the Cabinet Office in number 10 and say, we need other people taken from other parts of government and brought into number 10? Why was it necessary to have your friends, your colleagues, put into number 10?
Well, I did do exactly what you just asked. What you said, why didn't I do that? I literally did do that at scale. I spoke to the Cabinet Secretary about it, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, multiple other people in the Cabinet Office. Part of the whole point of bringing Tom Shinner in was that I knew that he had been involved in the Cabinet Office with the whole Brexit no-deal preparations, which was as close as anybody had had, probably since World War II, to actually managing an extremely large-scale, very, very complex set of operational and logistical questions. I knew also that Tom had because of this, and also because of some other aspects of his career, which I won't go into, extensive networks across the system, into the military, into all sorts of things. So he was perfect. He was much better placed than me or anybody else, really, in number 10, to know, oh, we should call General so-and-so and get him to help with this. We should get so-and-so in to help with that. So that was the logic behind bringing Tom in.
Was Mark Warner a member of the civil service?
No, Mark Warner was is a CEO of an AI company, but he was working at that time with Simon Stevens and Patrick Vallance on data issues around the NHS completely fortuitously. So it obviously made sense, given that him and his company were kind of embedded in the NHS structure. And so, sorry, just to make it completely clear, Mark and faculty got involved with the NHS and data before COVID ever started. So they were already in there working on these issues. So it obviously made sense for us all to kind of integrate. And then they helped build the dashboard.
Was Ben Warner a member of the civil service?
He was a special, well, I think his status at this time was actually, might not have been officially confirmed, but he became a SPAD.
When you asked him to join Number 10, did he come from the civil service?
He did not.
Did Demis Hassabis come from the civil service when you asked him to attend SAGE and to assist you in your hour of need?
He was CEO of DeepMind. He was a very different category of person.
Was he a member of the civil service?
Of course not.
No.
Neither was Tim Gowers. He was Professor of Maths at Cambridge.
A number of witness statements before the inquiry refer to the fact that there was a dysfunctionality, a lack of a proper working relationship between the Cabinet Office, Number 10 and other departments. There was a lack of clarity about who was leading. There was an overall absence of a sufficiently organised response. Nobody knew, in essence, who was in charge. Who do you go to in order to get decisions out of the government machine? Would you agree with those sentiments?
That was a general description, 2019 and 2020. I would say it improved, obviously, once the COVID task force was created. That brought in a lot more clarity and the kind of COVID-S, COVID-O. So things certainly improved from the summer, partly thanks to Tom and Helen McNamara and others. But certainly until we did that, it was extremely chaotic.
You attempted, according to your statement, to bring about a major reorganisation in the layout and the structures of Number 10, initially in late January.
Early January, first week of January.
All right, well, late January is taken from your statement. You then returned to this subject in May, and we know, of course, that there were changes to the Cabinet Office structure and to the committee structure in Number 10, or the meeting structure in Number 10. Did you, in general terms, have success in your attempts to reorganise the structures?
I would say generally failure with pockets of success. So I think we managed to create the Number 10 data science team, which I started working on in the first week of January. It was obviously interrupted by the COVID first wave nightmare, but we created that, and that proved really critical. It brought in crucial different skills, crucial different people with a very different mentality to the civil service. So that was I would say, a rare success.
Sorry,
but if
just pause there, please, Mr. Cummings. So in relation to the establishment of a proper data science team and a process, a system for getting in data and disseminating it around Number 10,
yeah,
that broadly worked. And we know, of course, there was a dashboard and there was a 10DS team set up.
Yes, in January there was some scepticism about the whole thing in the Cabinet Office and resistance, but once everyone had gone through February, March, April and the nightmare, then actually resistance completely flipped, and the Cabinet Secretary and many other senior people actually completely supported doing it.
Were there substantive changes to the personnel in Number 10 or the Cabinet Office? The human resource side?
Yeah, there were huge changes in the Cabinet Office, and core teams that were put in charge of COVID were repeatedly created, repeatedly dissolved. We were repeatedly told in Number 10 that they'd had burned out from stress and they'd gone. So yes, there was, I would say until by September, that was a little bit more stable. The task force structure existed. People had a much better sense of what their job was. It was still dysfunctional in various ways, but it was much different than it had been in May.
What about the Department of Health and Social Care as the lead government department? Your statement states that the DHSC was overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis in February to May. It couldn't build capacity on testing, on drugs, and was bad at asking the Cabinet Office for help. When it became apparent that the DHSC was unable to discharge the heavy burden placed on it as the lead government department, why were changes not instituted?
Well, I think the Cabinet Office was... remember, the Cabinet Office is responsible for dealing with a problem like that, and the Cabinet Office itself was overwhelmed. It was overwhelmed by the crisis. It was overwhelmed by its own staff being out with COVID. It was overwhelmed by internal ructions about how the hell this had all been allowed to happen. So I think the Cabinet Office was slow in getting to grips with the problem of the Department of Health. I think, though, also undoubtedly, I'm afraid that the story that the Secretary of State for Health kept telling us around the Cabinet table contributed to that. As the Cabinet Secretary himself said, Hancock has not been clear in asking us for the help he needs, and that's contributed to the problem. So I think, as they say in Moscow, everyone's white and everyone's unhappy. This was one of those examples that the Cabinet Office had serious problems, the Department of Health had serious problems. The coordinating mechanism to solve that itself had crumbled under the pressure.
It is very obvious that there were a large number of criticisms made by you of the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Matt Hancock. We'll look at some of those observations later. Where did you or Number 10, however, suggest structural changes to the lead government department, to the DHSC, changes in the way in which it operated in order to ensure a better service in the face of this crisis? Where is that debate? Where were those changes proposed?
So also bear in mind, in April, when we really started to discuss this, I discussed it with the Cabinet Secretary. Of course, the PM had just nearly died and was off in Chequers. So discussing it was inevitably very tricky. But I talked to the Cabinet Secretary in April about these issues. We discussed the possibility of splitting up the Department of Health in various ways. Formally, informally, we discussed creating various task forces to take critical work away. And of course, we actually did that. In an ironically odd way, the scale of the nightmare in March, April actually made it much easier for us to make such a monumental decision as taking vaccines out of the Department of Health and creating a separate task force. Similarly on testing.
To pause you there, I'm going to ask you please to try to keep your answers a little more concise. I appreciate it's difficult. So the way in which task forces were set up was a reflection, if you like, of the understanding that the DHSC was not performing. So you had a test and trace task force, you had a vaccine task force, PPE task force, and so on.
Yes,
is that correct?
Correct. But to be fair, not just that they were that they were performing poorly. It was a once-a-century event, and they were clearly overwhelmed. And I think even if you imagined everything had been working 10 times better, there would still have been very powerful arguments for having specific task forces aimed at specific things.
All right. The inquiry's heard a great deal of evidence about the workings of SAGE, and the majority of that evidence has been received from members of SAGE, its constituent parts. From the viewpoint of Number 10, did the SAGE government liaison, the process by which the government received advice from SAGE, work well?
So I think SAGE did a brilliant job at coordinating scientific expertise. I think Patrick Vallance did a brilliant job in chairing it and organising it. But I think that the mechanism whereby SAGE's thought processes were conveyed to Number 10 could be radically improved, because they were fundamentally oral briefings from Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty on the one hand, and the consensus minutes on the other hand, and then often very confused interpretations of what they had heard by officials in the Cabinet Office who did not necessarily have the skills and background and technical understanding to be able to explain those things well to Number 10.
Pausing there, just to split those answers up, please, Mr. Cummings, in relation to the reporting system through the Chief Medical Officer and the government's Chief Scientific Advisor, were those briefings by them to government recorded or were they oral?
What do you mean by recorded? Do you mean minuted?
Well, were they minuted? Did they produce papers in support of everything they said? Or was this funnel of communication largely an oral one?
It was largely an oral one, though of course the private secretary would record notes from the meeting and then issue action points and other things in the normal way from the private office.
The SAGE minutes were, as you've described them, consensus documents, and others have described them similarly. Did Number 10 get a proper understanding of the width of debate that had taken place before SAGE and of the nuance of these extremely difficult and complex issues?
In my opinion, obviously not. I mean, there's no substitute for actually listening to these conversations oneself and interrogating people. I'm not saying by that the SAGE minutes themselves were a bad product. I think they were a good product and a useful product. But if you're asking about the nature of a crisis like this involving the Prime Minister having to make extraordinary decisions, he obviously needed much richer information than the SAGE minutes could provide.
You are critical in your statement of the way in which the Cabinet Office commissioned work from SAGE, and you say, on occasion, the wrong questions were asked of SAGE.
Mm-hmm.
You, and we know, I think, Demis Hassabis, your friend, attended SAGE. Why did no one say to SAGE bluntly and plainly, we want you to indicate much more clearly what your recommendations are. We need a much clearer understanding of what you suggest. And this is the government strategy, so that you know to what you should direct your advice.
Well, with respect, it wasn't my job to try and commandeer SAGE and start giving them orders about how they should operate. I spoke privately to Patrick Vallance about things. I suggested, for example, getting some external people like Gowers and Hassabis to attend and listen and review the papers. But it wasn't for a political advisor to start giving SAGE orders about how it should operate.
Well, if you'll allow me to suggest, Mr. Cummings, you weren't just a political advisor. You were in a position to exercise a significant degree of control and power at the heart of Number 10. If you saw there was a problem in terms of the route of advice and the communications that you were receiving, why was this not publicly raised?
Well, as you know from the various evidence, I sent Ben Warner to attend the meetings and discuss them. I listened to some of them myself. Also, from the beginning of January, I had at least weekly meetings, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week with Patrick, where I would talk to him myself about all sorts of things about science, but also, obviously, as time went on, increasingly about COVID. So I did push on these things, and I did probe, and I did talk to Patrick about them all. My criticism is not of Patrick. I think the fundamental problem was the interface between SAGE, DHSC, and the Cabinet Office. And my point that you refer to in my evidence is, this is not I'm not a technical person, so this is not my expertise I'm reflecting. The data people who were extremely smart and able, who came in to help us, they said to me, the Cabinet Office is asking the wrong questions and misinterpreting the answers. And that was a problem both before the first wave and as we emerged out of the first wave.
You asked your friend Ben Warner to attend SAGE.
I did.
You spoke privately to the government's Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance. You hadn't held back from making recommendations in relation to structural changes that, in your view, were required to be made to the Cabinet Office, to Number 10, to the DHSC. Mm-hmm. Why did you not publicly say there is a real problem with the structural route by which SAGE advises the government, and we are not getting a proper understanding of the picture?
Well, I don't think it would have been a good idea for me to say publicly something like that. But I did
to your
say,
colleagues in government.
I did say that to colleagues in government. I also spoke to Patrick about making the SAGE. I also had a very strong view that the SAGE minutes and other documentation should be made public in February for scrutiny. And actually, Patrick was very good about that, and Patrick completely agreed. Unfortunately, again, the culture of secrecy in the Cabinet Office blocked that, not just February, March, but actually kept blocking it for, I can't remember how long, but for a very long time.
In your statement, in relation to the issue of the substantive advice you received from SAGE, or rather the advice that the government received from SAGE, you say that it was represented to the government that SAGE was broadly in agreement with the strategy of mitigation, and we'll come back in a moment to look at that in more detail, or Plan A, as you call it.
Yeah.
But that subsequently, you were told that SAGE members on the SAGE committee, denied that they had been generally in support of a mitigation strategy.
Yes.
When were you told that that representation of SAGE's position was inaccurate?
I'm not sure exactly, but you could start to see it in what they themselves said after the first lockdown happened. From that point on, a lot of people around SAGE started to talk as if they'd been recommending this for a long time, whereas, as you can all see from the evidence, they weren't even recommending it in the week of the 9th of March.
That was obviously an extremely serious problem. The government's sole scientific advisory group for emergencies was not, it would seem to you, and what you were told, accurately giving you a proper reflection of the debate in that committee.
Well, I wouldn't put it like that. I think actually I would say the problem in lots of ways was actually worse than that. That it was represented to us, even in the week of the 9th of March, that that SAGE collectively agreed with the DH plan of single peak herd immunity by September. And indeed, as you can see from the public record on YouTube, many people from SAGE actually gave interviews that week articulating that Plan A strategy.
So, at least after the first wave, Mr. Cummings, it was obvious to you that the information that you had received from SAGE on behalf of the government was to some extent inaccurate. It hadn't been a fair reflection on what you've said of the views of its members. SAGE, you say in your statement, had not made plain that there was a viable alternative to mitigation. They had not made plain, at least until quite late in the day, that the numbers of deaths and hospital cases would be massive.
Sorry, the last sentence is not accurate.
Until quite late in the day. When did SAGE tell you that they had concerns that the infection fatality rate and the infection hospitalization rate would mean an inevitable wave of death and hospital cases?
I don't remember the exact date, but if you look at multiple graphs from COBRA that went through SAGE, you can see that people were envisaging a scale of death that would overwhelm the NHS, certainly in February.
Late February, wasn't it, Mr. Cummings?
I would say early February.
Well, we'll have a look and you can tell us where those documents are. Did SAGE tell you that effectively there was no means of controlling the virus once it had reached the United Kingdom?
I wouldn't say that SAGE told us that. I would say that Number 10 was told that was the consensus view of CCS in the Cabinet Office and Department of Health and SAGE, that fundamentally, Number 10 was told in January and February that the most significant danger that we faced was a second wave happening later in 2020. And that was what everyone was trying to avoid. And that's why the single major peak by September approach was taken.
We'll come back to that doctrinal debate. strategy. But I'm asking you, Mr. Cummings, why, if it had become apparent to you that you had not been able to understand accurately what SAGE believed, or you had not received a fair reflection on what SAGE was debating and what it thought, why, after the first wave, did you not bring about changes to the SAGE structure and the advisory structure in the way that you had advocated for the Cabinet Office, the DHSC, Number 10, the Civil Contingency Secretariat, and so on?
Well, I literally did. I mean, we created the data science team, and part of the whole point of the data science team was that you had actual, very deep technical experts that could red team and explore what SAGE was saying and give the Prime Minister advice on what was coming from SAGE, how to interpret it, potential problems with the advice that was coming from SAGE, etc. And that team actually did that job.
Excuse me, that was data within Downing Street. You set up the 10DS, the 10 data system, or 10 Downing Street data system.
Mm-hmm.
What changes did you advocate or propose in relation to the constitution of SAGE and the means by which it informed government of its advice?
So the main thing that I personally did was to institute the 10DS data science team, because that was the exact appropriate kind of thing that Number 10 needed to interpret these scientific and technical questions with skills, with tools that didn't exist at all in January, February, March in Number 10 or the Cabinet Office. I did not regard it as my job to tell the SAGE people and Patrick Vallance how to manage SAGE. My view was that Number 10 and the Prime Minister's Office critically needed deep technical, scientific and data science skills and tools right at the heart of power that could interpret information coming in not just from SAGE, but from everybody all around the whole system, including Test and Trace, including the Joint Biosecurity Centre, and dozens of other entities.
All right. We're going to move on to a new issue, which is the consideration of vulnerable and at-risk groups in the course of the decision-making between February and the lockdown decision of the 23rd of March. Can you tell the inquiry, please, to what degree the position of vulnerable and at-risk groups was considered by decision-makers in Downing Street during the run-up to the decision to impose a national lockdown?
Could you say exactly what you mean by vulnerable and whatever it was? I'm sorry.
Yes. Persons who would be potentially vulnerable to the impact of a lockdown, members of minority ethnic groups, people who are vulnerable in terms of socioeconomic deprivation, victims of domestic abuse, people for whom there was plainly a case to be made that they would require specific consideration in terms of what the impact of the lockdown decision would be.
I would say that entire question was almost entirely appallingly neglected by the entire planning system. There was effectively no plans or any plan even to get a plan for a lot of that. As you could see from the evidence, one of the most appalling things of the whole enterprise in lots of ways was on the 19th of March when we realised that there was essentially no shielding plan at all, and the Cabinet Office was trying to block us creating a shielding plan. I think there was a brilliant young woman in the Number 10 private office called Alexandra Burns who tried to raise warnings about things like wives who are being abused and children in care, and a lot of similar things, and I don't think the system ever properly listened to her.
Do you recall when the Prime Minister was advised of the risk of long-term sequelae arising from COVID infection?
So I don't know what sequelae means.
Consequences. So persons who suffered from what is now known as the syndrome long COVID. When was it first understood that there could be long-term health problems, health conditions associated with it?
It was obviously discussed in January in general terms, in the sense of Patrick and Chris and others saying to us, of course, we don't know what the long-term consequences of this might be. They essentially said, there's kind of problem A, how many people it just kills immediately, but then there's problem B, what the long-term health consequences may be. At the moment, obviously, by definition, we've got no data and information on that. So we knew of it as a general problem in January, but it really kind of bubbled up, I would say, but I'm guessing, I'm not sure if that's helpful, in roughly May.
I think in May, the Prime Minister shared on a WhatsApp group with you, the Chief Scientific Advisor, the Chief Medical Officer, you and Matt Hancock WhatsApp group, an FT article entitled Mystery of Prolonged COVID-19 Symptoms. Do you recall that?
Vaguely.
What about the issue of the disproportionate number of deaths in the black and minority ethnic communities?
I mean, it was discussed after the first wave.
When did it first become apparent that there was a disproportionate fatality rate in those communities?
I can't remember, I'd be guessing, but I think the data that came out of the first wave showed that that was an issue.
All right. Preparedness. Much of your statement focuses on your opinion that there had been a critical failure to plan for the type of pandemic which, in the event, ensued, and an absence of critical capabilities, as you describe them. In essence, that in January and February 2020, there was no system, no plan, no structure in place that could have allowed either the borders to be sealed or for any kind of scaled up test and trace process. Dealing with those two aspects in turn, in relation to the borders, the material shows that in Downing Street there was regular reconsideration of what could be done in terms of keeping the virus out of our border. What was the advice that was received from SAGE as to whether or not that would be an efficient or effective process?
It was twofold. First of all, it was that, threefold. First of all, we didn't actually have the capability to do it because obviously Britain has not been able to control its borders for many years. It doesn't have data to do it, doesn't have infrastructure to do it in general, never mind for a pandemic. So, first of all, there wasn't the capability. Second, we were told, even if we had the capability, it would only delay things by a relatively trivial amount. And third, of course, people at that time, the reaction from a lot of people was closing the borders is racist. You remember when the supermodel Caprice said on TV, why aren't we closing the borders? A lot of people, public health experts, mocked her as if she was an idiot. That was the prevailing conventional wisdom from the public health system, and was reflected, the dismissal of Caprice, I would say, was reflected in number 10 by the public health system. And of course, if you're going for a single wave herd immunity by September fundamental strategy, then faffing around at the borders wasn't regarded as relevant or coherent with such a strategy.
By that, do you mean if the strategy of the government was to accept that by mitigating the worst severity of that first wave of the virus and thereby allowing a proportion of the population to become infected nevertheless, there was no point in trying to shut our borders because part of that strategy entailed allowing part of the population to become infected. Is
correct? That's what the Prime Minister and I were told. Yeah.
But SAGE and NervTag specifically advised the government against border screening because they took the view that it would be ineffective. You can't test in the absence of a testing system for asymptomatic patients. You can conceal your symptoms. You may even become infected on a plane and no symptoms will show until after you've arrived. So did the government not appreciate that in practical terms, such a step would be extremely difficult to put into practice?
Well, yes, we would I'm not sure if I've misunderstood, but one of us has misunderstood. We were told that it was impossible. We were told the British state couldn't do it in January. We didn't have the infrastructure to do it. They didn't have the tests to do it. Didn't have any of the things that you need to do it to control the border. But at the same time, it wasn't regarded as a big problem, given that people didn't want to control the border anyway.
Is that fair, Mr. Cummings? Sage and NervTag produced papers which were sent to the government and which you presumably saw, setting out why in practice screening, restrictions, or even an elemental quarantine system would not work in practice. It wasn't a doctrinal position, was it?
No, well, I think that obviously if you're just saying, do you actually control the borders, does that solve the problem? Of course the answer is no. And if you're looking at just at the specific issue of what the effect of controlling the borders would be, then of course the answer is clear, and what Sage and NervTag said, Surge and NervTag said makes sense. But that's obviously not the real question. The real question is, should you have the capabilities like Singapore or Taiwan to combine actual serious border control with a domestic test and trace regime and the data to support it and all the other things you need to support it, and then roll out mass testing? If you had the capability to do that, which I very strongly suggest this country ought to acquire, then obviously controlling the borders is a critical issue.
Mr. Cummings, without a scaled up test, trace, contact, isolate system, shutting the borders will not suffice on itself. So the problem here was not that there was a doctrinal decision not to consider shutting the borders. It was that in practice it would do no good, and without a test, trace, contact, isolate system, and there was none, it would never work.
Correct.
Is that the nub of the issue?
It's half of the nub of the issue, but the other half of the nub is that if you regard the whole thing in a fatalistic way anyway, which DH and the Cabinet Office and Sage did at the beginning, and you think that there is no effective alternative to herd immunity, if you say that at an overall conceptual level, there's either A, shape a curve towards herd immunity, or B, try to build your way out of the problem. The entire system in January, February, early March thought that the only plausible approach to this was to shape the curve of herd immunity. No one thought it was really practical to build our way out of the problem. The fundamental U-turn that we shifted to was to try and build our way out of it instead of fatalistically accepting.
The material shows that you spent a great deal of time in April, May, June trying to get on top of the test problem.
Yeah.
At what point in January and February, or indeed even March, did the penny drop in the government that the absence of a scaled up or significant test and trace system effectively meant there was no means of controlling the virus once it had reached the United Kingdom?
Well, of course, until the week of the 9th of March, the entire system was just sort of rolling along the single peak strategy by September. And there were conversations and references before that week to, we've obviously got to do more testing, but that wasn't that was more just sort of, we need more tests for the NHS and maybe a few thousand and blah, blah, blah. It wasn't conceived, testing wasn't conceived at the end of February, beginning of March, in the context that it would be seen in April, May, June, i.e. scaling to hundreds of thousands, then millions, then potentially tens of millions. I think what really brought it home, certainly to me in the PM, was when we were suddenly told in that week of the 9th, and it was one of the things that involved pennies dropping, that essentially testing had been stopped.
12th of March.
Yes, if you say so, but it was around then.
And so that we can understand the importance of this issue, is it your position that if there had been a sophisticated, competent system for test, trace, isolate in existence or brought into existence in January, February, March. And other countries, the inquiry is aware, did precisely that. South Korea is a very good example. It may not have been necessary to go the whole hog and to mandate the imposition of a national lockdown, because the means of controlling the virus would have been at hand with the test and trace system, and therefore no need to control it with a lockdown.
Yes, my view is that what ought to have happened is that as soon as the first reports came at the end of December, on roughly New Year's Eve 2019, we should have immediately closed down flights to China. We should immediately have had a very, very hardcore system at the airports and borders, and there should have been a whole massive testing infrastructure ramping up, both for test and trace in a kind of conventional sense, but also a manufacturing and industrial capacity system to manufacture the rapid tests at scale. I mean massive scale of tens of millions a week. I think if you'd had that combination of actual serious border control, and this country for the first time ever actually controlling its borders and taking it seriously with test and trace, and then a kind of out of the box, here's how you massively scale rapid testing, and you put all of those things together, brackets arguably also with human challenge trials on vaccines, close brackets, then I think in retrospect that's clearly the would have been a much better approach, not just in terms of deaths, but also in terms of us being able to keep open the economy, to a massively greater extent than we were able to. So it would have been better in both ways.
You say, Mr. Cummings, in retrospect, no one, not even you, with your keenness to ensure that the government system could be made to work efficiently, appreciated in February, March, that without such a scaled-up test and trace system, the options for the United Kingdom government were going to be extremely limited indeed.
So I wouldn't quite put it like that. We did appreciate that we didn't have these things, and there are, as you can see, there are references from me to Singapore and whatnot in multiple groups and emails and whatnot. And people like Mark Warner were saying to me, why is there just this fatalism on the subject?
Slow down.
So we were aware of it.
But nothing could be done.
But it was all obviously too late. You can't just pull a system like this out of thin air in a few days.
Conceptually, doctrinally, the British government's position in February and the early part of March had been viruses come in waves. In order to ensure that the first wave doesn't strike us during the winter months, the best policy is to mitigate it, to take the top off, delay it so it's closer to the summer, and that way we'll avoid the risk of that wave, if it is completely suppressed, recoiling like an uncoiled spring later in the year with a devastating second wave. Plan A. Why was it not appreciated after March and April and the first wave that such a test and trace system would avoid the risk of a second devastating wave?
Well, with respect, I think it was appreciated, certainly in parts of the system. I mean, you can see I wrote it on whiteboards around about the 13th, 14th of March as part of shifting to Plan B. So, so people in Department of Health and elsewhere were building up testing in February, early March. There were plans to do that, but they were not thinking at that time about test and trace. Once we made this flip, around about the 13th to the 15th, I talked to the PM about it on Saturday the 14th of March, and Valence and I talked to the PM about it on Sunday the 15th of March as part of this different conceptual approach of building our way out of the problem.
You misunderstand me. During that first stage with Plan A, with mitigation, the argument being put against suppression was it'll recoil like an uncoiled spring with a devastating second wave. If you push the first wave down, it'll spring back.
Yes.
So before the change in strategy, why was it not understood? Well, don't worry. We will deal with the first wave, but by the time the second wave comes along, if it does recoil like an uncoiled spring, we can deal with it with a proper test and trace system. Why wasn't that debate had when the government was still in the first strategic response?
So if you're asking why were we not talking about test and trace before roughly, say, the 13th of March, yes. The answer is because no one, before, remember, in the first time that there was no plan for lockdown at all in the week of the 9th. The plans for lockdown only came after we started to change. So there was no, the whole point of the problem up to the week of the 9th was that the whole system fatalistically thought there was no way you could possibly do a lockdown in Britain. It was thought of as the completely crazy idea. So of course people were not thinking, well, let's do lockdown and then build test and trace. Everyone thought, well, we obviously can't do lockdown, and lockdown's mad because it will all come back.
But they were thinking about, and they were advocating, suppression. That is to say, the squashing down completely of a first wave.
No, sorry, no. Who do you think was arguing for that?
The one-wave strategy, Mr. Cummings, envisaged a mitigation, and then this argument arose as to whether or not a suppression strategy, which allowed the wave to recoil, the spring to uncoil, would result in a second devastating wave. So why was there not a debate about what could be done to prevent that second wave? Why was it not thought about?
Well, I think I'm not quite. Possibly I'm confused by your language. I don't know. I'm not quite understanding your question. But I'll try and put it this way. Up to and including the week of the 9th, the assumption was, so you're suggesting there was some great debate. The whole point was there wasn't a debate. There was an assumption across government, across the Cabinet Office, Department of Health and SAGE, that lockdown was impossible in a Western country. Anyway, we didn't have all of the things that you needed in place to actually do it. You didn't have test and trace and whatnot that you'd need to have afterwards. That vaccines were almost definitely not going to have any impact, at least in 2020 and possibly never. So the whole point was that up to and including the week of the 9th, that the debate you keep referring to, there wasn't a debate. That was the whole problem. There wasn't a debate about the fundamental assumptions underlying Plan A. There wasn't a debate until me and others started saying, hang on a second, if you actually follow the logic of what Plan A is, it's going to be a catastrophe. And we have to ask these questions and we have to consider an alternative Plan B. But before that, there was no debate about this. It was just assumed.
There was a debate at the scientific level between mitigation and suppression. But it may be that that debate and the merits of mitigation versus suppression simply didn't reach your level in government.
Well,
and that you weren't aware the scientists were debating the pros and cons of mitigation versus suppression.
Of course, it was discussed by people, but as you can see in all of the SAGE, in all of the SAGE and DH documents, the assumption from everybody was that it was simply completely impractical, and everyone was still on the mindset of a flu pandemic. So, of course, there were debates, in one sense going on, and there were scientists, et cetera, et cetera. But the core of what we were presented with in number 10 was there is unanimity between the Cabinet Office, Department of Health and SAGE behind the propositions that the real danger is a second wave in the winter, and therefore you have to manage a single peak strategy so there's herd immunity by September. That was the core argument that we were presented with. And that was never really proper. The first time I actually really saw that being tested was on the 18th of March when Demis Hassabis said to SAGE, essentially, I think this whole plan is mad and you should immediately lock down, like now, this hour, tell the PM to do it immediately. And that kicked off various discussions.
And the consequence of the absence of debate, the failure to consider any alternative, the failure to consider strategic options other than mitigation and squash the sombrero, was that there was a woeful absence of plan, any sort of written document for dealing with controlling borders, protecting care homes, shielding, quarantine.
Correct. I mean, I would say it's actually worse than that, and sort of doubly ironic, because if Plan A had been what ended up being Plan B, i.e., we'd actually got on top of it and controlled it, and you had test and trace infrastructure and everything else, then there would actually be a much stronger argument for saying, well, a lot of the shielding stuff we don't need, a lot of this we don't need, a lot of that we don't need, because we've actually controlled the virus.
Mr. Cummings, please slow down. You're making it extremely difficult to record your evidence. And to be fair...
Well, sorry, just to finish that point, because it's important. The situation is worse than what you're describing, because if you are not going to control the virus, if you are not going to have test and trace, if you are just going to have single peak herd immunity by September, it actually makes the lack of a plan for shielding and care homes and everything else even more crackers. Do you see my point?
Yes. And to be fair, you texted Mr. Hancock on the 23rd of January about the existence, the whereabouts of pandemic plans and preparations. I think you asked, to what extent have you investigated preparations for something terrible like Ebola or flu pandemic? And you were reassured that there were full plans up to and including pandemic levels, prepped and refreshed. It became obvious, and it's obvious from your statement, that you appreciated that there were no plans of the type that you've described. By the middle of March, so 16th of March, a week before the national lockdown, had number 10 still been provided, or had it been provided in any way, with departmental plans, Cabinet Office plans from line departments dealing with these various aspects of a coronavirus pandemic?
Essentially, no. There were all dribs and drabs came in. You can see from various evidence of texts and emails from me. After talking to Hancock, I pushed on some of these things through February. Imran did as well from private office. But we gradually became aware through the course of February that essentially what Hancock had told me on the 25th, sorry, correction, just on the date, by the way, the inquiry and I have wrongly changed the date from the 25th to the 23rd of that text message. So my statement is now wrong, but it should be 25th, but we'll correct that afterwards. But yes, during the course of the 25th, in the course of February, we realised gradually as we pushed and probed and asked questions for these plans that they fundamentally didn't exist. And on the 16th, I think, you're probably referring to a shocking email in number 10 that says, essentially, the Civil Contingency Secretariat says that these plans are not even held centrally at all. So it turned out, to our horror, that the system that we'd been told repeatedly in number 10, trust the system, SPAD shouldn't get involved, world leading, best prepared in the world, blah, 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 it then turned out that this supposedly brilliant system, the Civil Contingency Secretariat, had not even seen these documents at that time because they were not held centrally, which was, I mean, when that email was circulated, people thought it was almost like a spoof.
All right. Well, in fact, we do have, of course, your text message to Matt Hancock in his reply. Your very own letter and statement have a screenshot, and it shows the 23rd of January. It says in terms 23rd of January 2020.
It does. The reason for that is...
To what extent have you investigated?
It does. The reason for that is I was told by the inquiry I got the date wrong and I should change it from the 25th to 23rd. But I actually checked it and it should be the 25th.
Don't trouble yourself. Your own screenshot provides the date of the 23rd of January 2020. So there were a number of COBRA meetings at the end of January and the beginning of February. I want to ask you about an important COBRA meeting on the 5th of February, 56215. Page 1 sets out the ministers who attended. Page 2, the officials and those who dialed in. And we can see that on behalf of number 10, Imran Shafi attended, along with Sir Ed Lister. Page 3, the attendees in terms of the chief medical officers. Page 5, paragraph 2, The CMO provides an update to Cobra, providing information about the number of individuals who had died and how long they had been in hospital before they died. This is all to do, of course, with cases abroad, and particularly China. The two most high-risk groups appear to be the elderly and those with pre-existing illnesses. If you could scroll back out, page 6, between paragraphs 9 and 11, there was a debate about planning for a reasonable worst-case scenario. And the director of the Civil Contingency Secretariat sets out the planning priorities for the work underway to develop planning assumptions for the pandemic flu reasonable worst-case scenario. There was then a debate about communication strategy, an emergency bill, and work with local resilience forums. On this day, or the day after, you sent a text to a WhatsApp group, the Number 10 Action WhatsApp group, saying, the chief scientist told me today it's probably out of control now and will sweep world. Were you aware of the tenor of the debate and what was being discussed in Cobra on the 5th of February?
Probably. I mean, I don't remember that particular. All of these meetings now, I'm afraid, blur into one another.
Had you seen this minute of the 5th of February Cobra, you would immediately have understood that the thinking expressed in this meeting was not that which you had been told, which was to the effect that the virus was probably out of control now and will sweep the world. Did that not concern you?
Yes.
What did you do around the 5th and 6th of February to say, this Cobra appears to be proceeding on an incomplete, inaccurate basis? It isn't reflecting what I understand to be the reality, which is that the virus is probably out of control and will sweep the world.
So I can't remember exact. Obviously now it's 3 years ago. I can't remember the exact days and whatnot, but around this time, so I spoke to Patrick before, obviously, that text was sent. I spoke to Patrick again. I probably spoke to him each day, actually, 5th, 6th, 7th. We had a conversation about this and about the briefing of the PM. Patrick and I agreed that we thought the PM had not been sufficiently briefed on a lot of this, on these questions, and we were concerned about it. And we agreed that I would fix up for there to be a meeting as soon as possible with the PM in his office, and that meeting happened on, I mean, it'll be in the documents, I can't remember exactly when, but very, very shortly after this. I think Patrick said to me something like, you know, this needs to happen straight away. It's possible that that was the Friday, and I think I organised it for the Monday, but my recollection of the exact dates could be a bit off.
There was a meeting on the 10th of February.
Is that the Monday?
10:45 and 11:15. That could possibly be a Monday or maybe a Tuesday, so that would fit with what you've said. There was another Cobra meeting on the 18th of February, 56227, pages 1 to 3 give us the attendees, and page 5 gives us a sense of what was being discussed. Repatriation of British nationals, and then over the page, legislation, a debate about the drawing up of a bill to be employed in a reasonable worst-case scenario, and then over the page, please, page 7, planning for a reasonable worst-case scenario, next phase. The Civil Contingency Secretariat said there was work to be done to create a clear plan of activity from the moment of sustained transmission to its estimated peak. Was there an understanding in number 10 that a debate about repatriation and the drawing up of appropriate legislation and the drawing up of plans to deal with a reasonable worst-case scenario did not really reflect what needed to be done in response to the information that was then available?
Certainly by some of us in Number 10 at that time, there was, yes. But remember, an awful lot of the senior people in the centre of Whitehall were off on holiday at this time.
The Prime Minister, the evidence shows, received a note in his box on the 30th of January, around about the same time, about coronavirus. He expressed the view on the 31st of January that he wanted to spend more time discussing issues with ministers, and then he received an update on the 3rd of February from the Civil Committee's Secretariat. There was then an email with an update on the 8th of February and the meeting on the 10th of February to which you have referred. We'll just have a look at the diary for that, 136739. This is the diary for the Prime Minister between the 10th of February and Friday the 14th of February. On the 10th of February, so you're right, it's a Monday, 10:45 to 11:15, coronavirus update. Before he went to Cheveney, which he did on the 14th of February, he received a note in his box, 136743, page 4. Coronavirus international response. Containment of the virus in China is a key part of preventing the spread of the outbreak to the United Kingdom. If what you were told by the chief scientist was right, the chief scientific advisor was right, Mr. Cummings, that there was an inevitability or a probable inevitability to the virus sweeping the world, then any debate about whether or not the virus could be contained in China was out of date. Why was the Prime Minister not told? Evidence is now emerging that this virus is out of control and will likely sweep the world, and debate about international repatriation and drafting of legislation and doctrinal identification of reasonable worst-case scenarios is behind us. We need to deal with that loss of control.
Well, I think there was still an awful lot.
Good afternoon. It's
the
Patrick
meeting that Patrick and I asked for
It's GBNews.
from memory, these things were discussed. But remember, at that point, it was still not at all seen in Whitehall like this is going to be. Nobody really in Whitehall thought that a month from now we're going to be in the biggest crisis the country's seen since 1945. The view was much more that if this is really going to happen, it's not going to happen for months. And you can see repeated references in documents to Number 10 and the Prime Minister that refer to, well, if there is sustained community transmission in Britain, then the crisis will come sort of 2 or 3 months after, which is repeated in various documents. I remember at this point, although there was, in fact, we now know, sustained transmission in this country at that time, that was not known then. So the whole system was, at this point, and not just now, but 3 weeks after this point, still thinking of this as something that was going to land on people in May, June, not something that was going to overwhelm everybody in mid-March.
You had sent a text to the Number 10 Action WhatsApp group on the 6th of February saying, the chief scientist told me today it's probably out of control now and will sweep the world.
OK, you're watching the afternoon session of the COVID inquiry. Dominic Cummings continuing to give evidence to Hugo Keith, KC, who's been cross-examining him since this morning. This is rolling on now, and we're about to cross to Patrick Christie's.
We are going to cross to Patrick Christie's, who will be live in Brighton a little bit later on. It depends on how quickly this wraps up at the COVID inquiry, but we'll be going to Patrick hopefully very soon indeed for you.
think it was just part of the general view from the Department of Health and the Cabinet Office that this was all still, murky and in the future. They weren't banging alarm bells at this point. Far from it. They were going skiing.
Why weren't you, though, Mr. Cummings? You were the one who had spoken to the chief scientist, or received a text from him.
Well, as you can see, I spoke to the chief scientist on multiple occasions, and I organised a meeting for him and Whitty to come in and talk to the PM and as they requested.
In the notes that went to the Prime Minister around the same time, why did you, as his advisor, perhaps chief advisor, not tell him? My information is containment has failed, the virus is coming.
Well, I did tell him that.
It's not here.
Well, the fact that things are not written down doesn't mean that they weren't communicated. Obviously, I was talking to the Prime Minister about all sorts of things all the time, and things that as I said, I was having repeated conversations with Patrick, many of which are not actually recorded in diaries from early January onwards. So lots of things like this I passed on. But overall, as you can see, the system was not in emergency mode at this time.
Do you accept that there is no formal communication to the Prime Minister from anybody at this stage saying the information from the Chief Scientist is to the effect that containment has likely failed?
I mean, you have the documents, not me, so I'm sure if you say so, I'm sure that's right.
And then the Prime Minister went to Cheveney.
If you're moving on, Mr. Keith, I think probably time for a break. Sorry to interrupt. 3:15, please.
All right.
Looks like they've adjourned for a break there. They said they'd be back at 3:15. So it looks like we have a 10-minute adjournment, no doubt, so they can take refreshments. We've learned a lot in this session. Initially, Dominic Cummings was extremely critical of Cobra, called it pointless, called it useless, and worst of all, saying that people would run out and talk jabbering. He said they would jabber to the media, talked of technical issues. They literally couldn't even display data to the Prime Minister at Cobra meetings, a complete chaotic situation, 50 people on meetings, and Dominic Cummings said we just weren't getting anywhere.
Yes, he seemed to say that the problem was that Cobra wasn't ready to be scaled up to such a crisis like the pandemic, that this was a war-like crisis, and it was more used to dealing with things like flooding and issues like that aren't on such a grand scale as the pandemic was. So he's suggesting there that it was too slow to scale up to the challenge.
That's right. And on the Cabinet Office itself, Cummings said that they were often overwhelmed with internal ructions, COVID absenteeism, and people were on core COVID teams repeatedly burnt out and left. And that he also said that the Prime Minister almost died of COVID, he stated there.
Yes, and he spoke about how the Department for Health was quickly overwhelmed, in his words. He said the Cabinet Office was slow in getting to grips with the problems that the Department of Health was facing. He also said Matt Hancock wasn't clear. He was not clear in asking Number 10 for the help the Department of Health needed. So again, it's this idea that everything was too slow to move. The mechanisms of government weren't working in the most optimal way that they could do. And he said this was one of the reasons why they decided to split up the Department of Health into various task forces to be able to deal with the issues more quickly.
Also added that the entire question of the impacts of lockdown on vulnerable people was almost appallingly neglected by the entire planning system, adding there was effectively no plan or even a plan to get a plan for a lot of that. And, of course, that's looking at the shielding of the most vulnerable people. He added there on the 19th of March when we realised that there was essentially no shielding plan at all.
Yes, and there was lots more as well, but we're going to go to a very quick break and hopefully Patrick will be on the other side. Will he? I shouldn't have said that.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the dinosaur hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker.